Section 1. Who are the Death Spectres? There is a place beyond the edge of the known galaxy where the light of the astronomicon barely reaches, where the stars are old and cold and dying, and the worlds that orbit them have long since stopped being places that living things should walk. The Imperium of Man, vast as it is, does not venture there. Its navigators refuse. Its fleets turn back. Its exploratory missions do not return. And even the High Lords of Terra, those most powerful and most arrogant of administrators who have steered 10,000 years of galactic history, quietly look away from that region of space and try very hard not to think about what might be happening in it. That region is called the Ghoul Stars, and out there, alone, cut off from support, cut off from supply lines, cut off from the astronomicon itself for long stretches at a time, a single chapter of Space Marines has been standing watch for roughly 7,000 years, not rotating in and out, not cycling through deployments like other chapters do, not requesting relief or reinforcement from the broader Imperium, just watching, waiting, fighting when things try to come through, dying when necessary, and doing it all over again, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium, in one of the most inhospitable and terrifying corners of the known universe, completely on their own. Their name is the Death Spectres. And the reason nobody can quite explain them is not because there is a lack of information. It is because the information that does exist raises questions so large and so unsettling that the answers seem almost impossible to contain in any ordinary framework of understanding. When you start looking into this chapter, you do not find a clean origin story and a proud record of battle. You find a founding that was never properly recorded. You find a homeworld built over an alien artifact of unknown origin and terrifying power. You find a chapter master who, upon taking office, sits down on that artifact and never stands up again, slowly turning to stone as it drains his life away. You find aspirants who are required to die as part of their initiation. You find a prophecy about something called the Great Resurrection that the entire chapter has been quietly working toward for thousands of years. And you find a chapter whose leadership genuinely believes that if they stop doing what they are doing, the Imperium itself will fall, and nobody outside the Death Spectres knows if they are right. That is what makes this chapter different from almost any other in Warhammer 40,000. Most chapters are strange in one or two ways. The Blood Angels carry a genetic curse that turns their warriors into screaming berserkers. The Space Wolves have a mutation that might one day transform them into something barely recognizable as human. The Exorcists go through a ritual that involves being briefly possessed by a daemon. Each of those is a single, extraordinary thing layered onto a foundation that is otherwise recognizable and comprehensible. You understand what they are and what they are doing and why. With the Death Spectres, almost every element of the chapter is extraordinary. The founding is mysterious. The homeworld is haunted. The leader is dying. The warriors train by dying and coming back. The enemies they face may not be alive in any conventional sense. The threat they were created to contain is so dangerous that 11 Space Marine chapters were destroyed, fighting it before anyone got around to creating the Death Spectres to make sure it never happened again. And underneath all of it, there is a prophecy and an artifact and a secret that the chapter guards more carefully than it guards anything else. A secret so sensitive that there is genuine worry about what the Inquisition would do if they found out. Let's go through all of it. Let's go through everything we know, every confirmed detail, every strange implication, and every question that the lore deliberately leaves unanswered. And by the time we are done, you will understand why this chapter, quiet and obscure as it is, might be one of the most important and most unsettling factions in the entire setting. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where this community stretches to. And if you are new here, hit subscribe, because this kind of deep lore is what we do, and there is a lot more of it waiting for you. Section 2. The Ghoul Stars, the most terrifying corner of the galaxy. To understand the Death Spectres, you first have to understand the place they were sent to guard. And the Ghoul Stars are not a location you can describe in ordinary terms, because ordinary terms do not quite capture what they are. Geographically, the Ghoul Stars sit at the extreme northeast of the known galaxy, well past the eastern fringe, in a region of wilderness space that lies almost entirely outside the reach of the Astronomicon. That matters more than it might initially seem. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon that radiates from Terra, powered by the sacrificed lives of thousands of human psychers each day, maintained by the Emperor himself. It is how Imperial ships navigate the warp. It is the lighthouse that allows humanity to cross the impossible distances of interstellar space without becoming lost forever in the nightmare realm of the immaterium. Without it, navigators cannot plot a course. Without a navigator, a ship cannot safely enter the warp. Without the warp, journeys that take weeks or months would take centuries. The ghoul stars sit at the edge of the Astronomicon's reach. In some parts of the region, it is said that sensitive navigators can barely sense the beacon at all, like hearing a whisper through several walls. In other parts, the signal may fail entirely. Most navigators refuse the journey outright. The ones who do make the trip describe a region of dying light and silent worlds, a place where the suns are old and cooling, their energy spent after billions of years, their warmth fading into the cold of deep space, like embers losing the last of their heat. The worlds they orbit are dark and still. Many of them were once inhabited, many of them are not anymore. And on some of those worlds, things still move. This is the part that the Imperium's records, what few remain, are careful and deliberate about. Things still move on some of those worlds, things that, by any reasonable assessment, should not be alive, things that the Death Spectres describe as supernatural. And that word, coming from Space Marines, is worth dwelling on. These are transhuman warriors who fight demons and necrons and creatures from the warp on a routine basis. They operate in a universe where the impossible is Tuesday. When they call something supernatural, they are not reaching for a dramatic word. They are being precise. Whatever lives in the ghoul stars operates outside the framework that Space Marines use to understand reality. The ghoul stars are described in various sources as a place of primal nightmare. Dead worlds lit by cold, dying suns, civilizations that were old before humanity crawled out of caves, entities that should not be alive and have not been alive for a very long time, but are still walking around, still moving, still pursuing purposes that nothing from the rest of the galaxy can identify or understand. It is a region where the Imperium's exploratory probes vanish without trace, where survey ships fail to return, where the question of what exactly is out there has never been satisfactorily answered, partly because everyone who goes to find out does not come back to report. What makes this even more disturbing is the nature of the threats that are known to exist there. There are multiple xenospecies confirmed or strongly suspected to be present in the ghoul stars, and each of them is strange in ways that go beyond the usual alien strangeness of the 40,000 universe. The Scythor fiends are perhaps the most documented, and what is known about them is deeply unsettling. The Death Spectres, who have been fighting them for millennia, have stated openly that the Scythor fiends are not alive in any way that human beings would recognize the term. They are described as masters of manipulation, who have embedded themselves in the power structures of other species, working their influence through the Borlak, the Loxatl, and the Nikasar civilizations. When their guile fails them, when persuasion no longer works, they transform into a battle form described as quite horrifying to behold. They build crystal fortress cities in the upper atmospheres of gas giants, vast structures floating impossibly in toxic skies. And when you come for those cities, when you bring your fleet and your armies, and you push through their outer systems, and you reach their homeworld expecting to finish the fight, you find the cities empty. The Scythor fiends are simply gone. The planet is deserted. And then, after a while, they come back. They always come back. This happened to the Death Spectres. They launched a major offensive campaign at some point before the 41st millennium, driving deep into Scythor fiend territory and pushing all the way to their homeworld, a gas giant, the Imperium, later designated 9,836 to 18 Gravecore. They found it deserted. They reported this experience to the Black Templars when High Marshal Helbrecht launched the Ghoul Stars Crusade in 990 M41. 8 years of grinding combat through Scythor systems, pushing to the same planet and finding it deserted again. Then Helbrecht tried to destroy the world itself with Exterminatus-class weapons, and found that the planet was somehow resistant to damage in ways that defied explanation. Whatever the Black Templars threw at it, it took an unnaturally long time to work, and Death Spectre's Captain Narush told Helbrecht plainly that it would not matter in the long run. The Scythor fiends would return. They always returned, and then Armageddon called, and the crusade was abandoned, and the mystery of Gravecore was left unresolved. Then there are the Necron flayed ones, particularly the ones associated with the Necron bone kingdom of Drazak. The flayed ones are Necron warriors who have been driven to an affliction called the Flayer Curse, a psychological corruption that compels them to wrap themselves in the flesh of living beings and imitate the biology they themselves lost when their race transferred their consciousness into metal bodies 60 million years ago. They are ghastly things, ancient warriors of an empire older than mammalian life on Terra, reduced by their own madness into something that wears meat like clothing. And they congregate in the Ghoul Stars, in that bone kingdom that sits deep in the dark, a charnel court of undying metal creatures who have long since left rational thought behind. And then there are the Thexians, a biomorphic species described as masters of manipulation who can shift their forms to suit the needs of the moment. Small in number but devastatingly effective, they have infiltrated multiple alien civilizations and redirected those civilizations toward their own ends. They are believed by many scholars to be the original source of the threat that triggered the Pale Wasting, though the evidence was almost entirely destroyed before it could be properly preserved. And beyond all of these known threats, there are things that do not even have names. Things that the Death Spectres fight in the dark and the cold. Things that the rest of the Imperium never hears about, because the rest of the Imperium does not pay attention to the Ghoul Stars, and because what little information does filter out is quickly suppressed or classified before it can cause a panic. This is the place the Death Spectres were sent, not as a temporary measure, not as the first wave of a broader Imperial campaign, as the permanent, probably forever garrison of the most nightmarish corner of the galaxy. One chapter, 7,000 years, completely alone. The Ghoul Stars do something to you when you study them long enough. The lore is deliberately fragmentary, a constellation of footnotes and half-sentences that lead you from one source to the next without ever arriving anywhere that feels like a conclusion. That is not a failure of world-building. That is the Ghoul Stars functioning exactly as intended, pulling you deeper, refusing to give you the bottom, leaving you uncertain about what is real and what is worse than real. The Death Spectres have lived inside that uncertainty for 7,000 years, and it has shaped them in ways that no other chapter in the Imperium has been shaped. Section 3. The Pale Wasting. The event that started everything. Every chapter has a founding, and every founding has a reason. Usually that reason is simple. A new warfront is opening. An existing chapter has been reduced to dangerous numbers. A region of space needs a permanent defender. The logic is administrative and military. The High Lords of Terra assess a need, requisition gene seed, establish a new chapter, give them a purpose and a homeworld, and send them off into the galaxy. The Death Spectre's founding has a reason too, but that reason is one of the most catastrophic things that ever happened during what is already a catastrophically grim period of Imperial history, and the fact that it has been almost entirely erased from the record tells you everything you need to know about how badly it went. In the late 34th millennium, the Imperium was in the midst of a period called the Nova Terra Interregnum. This was not a small crisis. This was a 900-year period during which the Imperium essentially fractured, the rebellious Council of Nova Terra claiming separate authority over the Segmentum Pacificus and dismissing the High Lords of Terra as legitimate rulers. At the same time, the Adeptus Mechanicus was tearing itself apart in something called the Moirae Schism, religious civil war erupting across Forge World after Forge World. The Imperium was fighting itself, internally divided, its institutions under enormous strain, its military stretched across a civil conflict that was consuming resources and attention at a brutal rate. And it was during this weakened, fractured, distracted period that something came out of the Ghoul Stars. It is called the Pale Wasting, and the historical record surrounding it has been almost entirely destroyed. What has survived is fragmentary and contradictory, scattered references in documents that were clearly meant to be expunged. partial accounts that do not agree with each other on basic details, and a silence so deliberate and so thorough that the silence itself becomes evidence of how terrible the event was. When the Imperium destroys its own records, it is not being careless, it is making a choice. The High Lords ordered those records gone because keeping them posed a risk that outweighed the value of the historical knowledge they contained. The Pale Wasting was something so dangerous, so psychologically destabilizing, that even the description of it was considered a hazard. What does survive suggests a dual-natured catastrophe. On one hand, the Pale Wasting is described as a star-spawned plague, a biological or perhaps something more than biological contamination that swept across world after world, eliminating the populations of human-settled planets with a thoroughness that defies conventional warfare, something that did not need armies to take a world, something that simply moved through a system and left dead worlds behind it. The word plague implies contagion, the spread of something from one host to another, the invisible propagation of horror across population after population without any visible hand pushing it. And in the chaos of the Nova Terra interregnum, with Imperial forces divided and distracted and fighting each other, there were not enough eyes turned toward the northeast to notice it coming until it had already consumed significant territory. On the other hand, the Pale Wasting is also described as nightmare engines slaughtering entire sector populations, machines, weapons, things with physical presence that killed in large numbers, methodically, and with extraordinary efficiency. These two descriptions do not obviously fit together. A plague and a war machine are not the same thing. Either the records that survived are describing two different phases of the same threat, or two different aspects of a single entity, or the different sources are looking at the same catastrophe from different angles and seeing different facets of something too large and too strange to fit neatly into any single category. Whatever it was, 11 Space Marine chapters were destroyed in the process of fighting it, not depleted, not reduced to skeleton strength and sent back to their homeworlds to rebuild, destroyed, gone. 11 entire chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, each numbering roughly 1,000 of the most lethal warriors humanity has ever produced, consumed by whatever came out of the ghoul stars during the Pale Wasting. The number 11 is worth sitting with for a moment, because that is not just a military disaster. That is roughly 1/10 of the entire active Space Marine force of the Imperium gone in a single campaign. The loss of 11 chapters would be, by any reckoning, among the most catastrophic military setbacks in Imperial history, outside of the Horus Heresy itself. And yet, the Pale Wasting is barely mentioned in the broader historical record. It appears as a footnote inside other entries, a reference tucked into the background of the Death Spectre's own chapter history, noted and then passed over. The Nova Marines chapter participated in the campaign and earned some of their earliest recorded battle honors there, but their own chronicles make no reference to the conflict whatsoever, a conspicuous and obviously deliberate absence. A stele inside the Imperial Palace on Terra praises the Nova Marines for their actions during the Pale Wasting and says, with careful and telling choice of words, that they helped unmake that which cannot die. Not that which was difficult to kill, not that which was powerful, that which cannot die. An enemy that the Imperium's own monument, inscribed in the Imperial Palace, describes as deathless, unmade, not destroyed, not exterminated, unmade. Whatever distinction that phrase is drawing, it is not a casual one. You unmake something that cannot simply be killed. You unmake something that exists in a way that killing does not adequately address. You unmake something whose manner of existing needs to be fundamentally disrupted, rather than just stopped. The word is precise, and it is disturbing, and it sits there in the stone of the Imperial Palace for anyone with the clearance to read it, which is to say, almost nobody. The aftermath of the Pale Wasting reshaped the Imperium's attitude toward the ghoul stars permanently. The High Lords of Terra, upon surveying the damage, upon counting the dead worlds and the lost chapters and the consumed sectors, made a decision. The threat had been contained, for the moment, but the ghoul stars remained, and whatever lived in them remained, and there was no reason to believe that the quiet that followed the Pale Wasting would last forever. They needed someone to watch the border, permanently, without needing to be relieved or reinforced. Someone who could hold a vigil at the edge of the galaxy without the supply lines and logistical support that a normal military force would require. Someone who could function autonomously, recruiting and sustaining themselves from whatever resources existed in the Ghoul Stars region, because getting regular resupply out to the northeast corner of the galaxy was simply not something the Imperium in its current fractured state could guarantee. And so, the 13th Founding was initiated. Section 4. The Dark Founding. The founding nobody recorded. Since the Horus Heresy, the Imperium has maintained what is called a gene seed tithe. Every Space Marine chapter is required to provide samples of their genetic material to the Adeptus Terra on a regular basis. These samples are stored in a secure archive, cataloged and recorded against the possibility that a chapter is destroyed and needs to be reconstituted, or that new chapters need to be created using existing genetic stock. It is an enormous and critical administrative system, the backbone of the Imperium's ability to maintain the Space Marine program across millennia, and it functions with the kind of obsessive imperial bureaucracy that means the records are kept in triplicate and checked against each other constantly, with one exception. The 13th Founding has no gene seed records on file. There are no reliable records indicating how many chapters were created during the Dark Founding. There are no records of which gene seed lines were used to create them. There are no records of how many chapters survived, or where they were sent, or what they were tasked with. The records that should exist are simply not there, and it is not clear whether they were destroyed, whether they were never created in the first place, or whether they are buried somewhere so deep in the administrative labyrinth of the Adeptus Terra that even concerted inquisitorial investigation has failed to locate them. This is the founding that created the Death Spectres. That fact alone is extraordinary. Every other founding in Imperial history is recorded. Even the ones that went badly, even the foundings, whose chapters later went rogue or fell to chaos, even the catastrophically ill-fated cursed founding of the 21st, which produced chapter after chapter with terrible genetic defects, those are all documented. The Imperium knows they happened. The Inquisition suppressed the records of the 21st Founding, but those records still exist somewhere. The 13th Founding appears to simply have no records at all. Whether this was deliberate or accidental is one of the great unresolved questions hanging over the Death Spectre's history, and there are several competing explanations. One possibility is that the 13th Founding was conducted in such secrecy, for reasons connected to the nature of the Pale Wasting, that recording it normally was considered a security risk. If the threat from the Ghoul Stars was as devastating as the Pale Wasting suggested, and if the methods used to counter it or contain it were sufficiently unusual, then keeping the Dark Founding out of the standard records might have been a deliberate precaution. You cannot learn about something from a record that does not exist. A second possibility is that the gene seed used in the 13th Founding was itself irregular in some way. The standard gene seed archive contains samples from all the loyal first Founding chapters. Creating a new chapter normally means selecting from that archive, choosing a gene seed line, and using it as the basis for the new chapter's biology. But what if the 13th Founding used gene seed that was not supposed to be in the archive? What if it used gene seed from a source that the Imperium had reason to conceal? This would explain why there are no records. If the gene seed's origin was something that could not be officially acknowledged, then the entire Founding would need to be conducted outside the normal administrative framework. A third possibility is that the records were destroyed in the same wave of deliberate suppression that consumed most of the Pale Wasting's documentation. If the High Lords decided that the full history of the 13th Founding and the threat that prompted it was too dangerous to preserve openly, then destroying the Founding records along with the Pale Wasting records would be consistent with that broader decision. The Death Spectres themselves are one of only 2 chapters known with confidence to have come from the Dark Founding. The other is the Exorcists, a chapter whose initiation ritual involves each Marine briefly serving as a vessel for a bound daemon before having it expelled, a process designed to make them unusually resistant to chaos corruption. The fact that both known chapters from this Founding are deeply strange, pursuing missions and using methods that no other chapters employ, adds weight to the theory that the 13th Founding was specifically designed to create unusual warriors for unusual purposes. There are hints of other chapters from this founding. The Crimson Sabers, a chapter that eventually fell to chaos and became known as the Crimson Slaughter, are suspected by some scholars to be a dark founding chapter, but this has never been confirmed. The idea that one of the Dark Founding's products might have turned traitor is its own disturbing thread, and if the 13th founding really did use irregular or unrecorded gene seed, the instability of chaos-tainted genetic material could explain that fall. For the Death Spectres, their gene seed is confirmed to be of Ravengard origin, sharing the same mutations and genetic flaws found in Corax's sons. This confirmation came not from official records, but from a Death Spectres librarian who stated it directly in a novel, specifically because the author, Steve Parker, got tired of the deliberate vagueness that Games Workshop maintained around every Space Marine chapter's origins, and simply had the character say it out loud. The gene seed is Ravengard. The Death Spectres are sons of Corax. But the official records say nothing at all about this. What that means in terms of the Dark Founding's true nature remains unclear. The Ravengard's gene seed is documented and available through normal channels. There is no obvious reason why creating a Ravengard successor chapter in the 13th founding would require the same level of secrecy applied to the founding as a whole, which might suggest that the Death Spectre's Ravengard heritage is the superficially comprehensible layer, and the actual reason for the Dark Founding's secrecy goes deeper than gene seed lineage. Something in what the Death Spectres were tasked with, or something in what they found when they arrived at their posting, might be the real reason the records are gone. Section 5. Origins of the chapter. Corcatus, the Vision, and the Arrival. A newly created Space Marine chapter is an extraordinary thing to observe, even setting aside the Death Spectre's particular strangeness. Hundreds of warriors created through a process of surgical implantation and genetic augmentation, each carrying their chapter's genetic heritage in 19 separate biological organs, each modified at a fundamental level to become something other than human. Then they are given a name, a heraldry, a gene seed lineage, and a mission. They are sent into the galaxy to find a home and to begin the long work of building a chapter. For the Death Spectres, that process began with a vision. Marin Corcatus was the chapter's first Megier, the first to hold the title that translates roughly as First Spectre, the Grandmaster, the eye that pierces the veil. When he stood before the Golden Throne and swore his oath of loyalty and service to the Emperor, when he laid his force sword at the Emperor's feet in the traditional gesture of fealty, something happened. The sword touched the floor, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Corcatus received a vision. The records of this vision are understandably vague. What we know is that the vision was specific enough to guide him to a particular world, to a particular location on that world, and to a particular spot beneath the surface of that world where something was hidden. The vision was not general. It was not a broad impression of duty or purpose. It was a set of precise instructions embedded in a moment of revelation, specific enough that Corcatus led his newly formed chapter to its new homeworld not by administrative assignment, but by the direction of what he experienced as the Emperor's direct communication. That world was Occludus. Occludus sits at the far northeast of Ultima Segmentum, at the edge of the Ghoul Stars. In terms of Imperial real estate, it is about as far from the comfortable interior of the Imperium as you can get, while still technically being within reach of the Astronomicon. It is a world with a particular history that adds another layer of strangeness to the Death Spectre's origins. In 063 M31, during the early years of the Horus Heresy, Occludus was already being used as a deep monitoring station at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, and it was under the command of Chrysos Morturg, a loyalist member of the Death Guard who survived the Isstvan massacre and refused to follow Mortarion into betrayal. Morturg is a fascinating figure in his own right. A psyker who was suppressed by Mortarion's hatred of witchcraft, a warrior isolated within his own legion because of his nature, a loyalist who found himself stationed at the very edge of the galaxy, commanding a small monitoring post with a handful of survivors, while the Horus Heresy consumed the galaxy behind him. What happened to him after the heresy is unknown. His fate by the time of the 13th founding is unrecorded, which is by now a familiar pattern in anything connected to the Death Spectre's history. But the fact that their homeworld had previously been occupied by a loyalist Death Guard commander is significant, even if we cannot say exactly how. There is a theory that the Death Spectres have some cultural or genetic connection to the Loyalist Death Guard, similar to the relationship that exists between other chapters and their unlikely spiritual predecessors. Whether this is a deliberate founding decision or a historical accident shaped by who was already on Occludus when Corcadus arrived, is another of those questions the lore refuses to answer cleanly. What Corcadus found when he arrived at Occludus was exactly what the vision had shown him. He led the chapter to a specific location on the world's surface, and they built their fortress monastery there. They named it Logopol, and they built it on the ground above a secret cavern deep beneath the planet's surface, a cavern that the vision had told Corcadus to find. And in that cavern, contained within an ancient dome that the Death Spectres call the Temple of Voices, they found the Sheriax. The Sheriax is described as an archaic throne made of glass. Its origins are unknown. Its purpose, in the fullest sense, remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in the galaxy. But its function is observable, and its effects on the Death Spectres have been shaping the chapter since the moment Corcadus first sat upon it. The world of Occludus itself has evolved over the millennia into something that perfectly reflects the character of the chapter that calls it home. It is described as a cemetery world, its surface covered with graveyards and tomb cities, silent places where the dead rest in a quiet that extends in every direction as far as you can see. The Death Spectres find peace among their dead. They walk the grave fields of Occludus between deployments, moving through the rows of markers and monuments that carry the names of battle brothers going back thousands of years, and they feel something that other warriors might struggle to identify as comfort, a sense of belonging to a long line of service that stretches back to the beginning of their history and forward into an unknown future. The fortress monastery of Logopol rises from this world of the dead like a monument to a different kind of existence, a structure that has been added to and expanded over 7,000 years of occupation, its walls layered with the heraldry and motifs of death and transcendence that the chapter uses to decorate everything it touches. Skulls and scythes and bone-pale colors, the visual language of an institution that has made death central to its identity in ways that go beyond mere aesthetic choice. Beneath it all, in the Temple of Voices, the Sheriax waits, and on the Sheriax, as he has sat since the day he took his oaths, sits the Megir. Section 6. The Sheriax, the Throne of Glass, and its terrible price. The Sheriax is a Xenos artifact. Nobody knows who made it. Nobody knows what it is, in the deepest sense of what it is capable of, or what its ultimate purpose is. It predates the Death Spectres by an unknown length of time. It predates the Imperium. For all anyone can tell, it might predate human civilization on Terra. It sat in its cavern beneath Occludus, waiting, for however long it sat there, until Corcadus came and found it, and sat upon it, and the Death Spectres understood, in that moment, what their chapter master's role would be for all the centuries to come. The way the Sheriax works is simple to describe and deeply terrible to contemplate. The chapter master of the Death Spectres, when he takes that office, does one thing on the day his oaths are sworn. He goes down to the Temple of Voices. He sits upon the Sheriax, and he never stands up again. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, literally. Every Megir who has ever led the Death Spectres since Corcadus has gone to the Throne of Glass on the day of their inauguration, sat down, and remained seated until they died. They do not leave to lead campaigns. They do not walk through the fortress monastery's halls. They do not take ceremonial walks among the grave fields of Occludus. They sit on the Sheriax, directing the chapter through the small number of officers who have regular access to them, the first captain and the chief librarian, who translate the Megir's will into the day-to-day decisions that keep the chapter functioning. Everyone else runs the chapter for the Megir, because the Megir cannot leave. What the Sheriax gives in exchange for this is power. Immense, staggering, poorly understood psychic power. The kind of power that can be felt by psychers in orbit around Occludus. Not on the planet's surface, not in the upper atmosphere, but in the void of space around the world. The psychic resonance of whatever the Sheriax is doing reaches that far. When the Megir turns even a fraction of that power towards some specific task, the implications are apparently staggering, though the lore is deliberately vague about exactly what those implications are. What the Shariax takes in exchange is the Megyear's life. And more than that, it takes their physical form. As the years pass, as the Shariax drains the life force from whoever sits upon it, that person begins to change. They begin to petrify. Their flesh hardens. Their skin turns to something increasingly resembling stone or glass or some combination of both, slowly replacing living tissue with a substance that belongs to neither biology nor geology in any conventional sense. It is not a sudden transformation. It is gradual, measured, decade by decade, as the Shariax consumes the Megyear and in return pours its power outward into the watch the Death Spectres maintain over the Ghoul stars. Eventually, the Megyear turns entirely to stone. It is worth sitting with the sheer quiet horror of this arrangement. A man, once a warrior of extraordinary capability, sits down at the height of his power and spends the rest of his life slowly being consumed by an alien artifact, unable to move, unable to participate in the battles his chapter fights, directing everything through intermediaries while he turns gradually to stone in the dark beneath a world of graves. And yet, every chapter master of the Death Spectres has done this, willingly, because the alternative, as the chapter understands it, is catastrophic. That understanding is where the Shariax becomes truly disturbing, because what the Death Spectres believe the Shariax is actually doing remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the galaxy. The official line within the chapter is that the Shariax is vital to maintaining their watch over the Ghoul stars, that whatever power it grants is essential to the chapter's ability to fulfill its purpose, and that without a Megyear on the throne, something very bad would happen to the Imperium as a whole. The operative phrase there is to the Imperium as a whole, not to the Death Spectres, not to the Ghoul stars region, to the entire Imperium. What exactly would happen is known only to the Death Spectres, and they will not say. The chapter treats the existence of the Shariax as their most closely guarded secret. There is specific worry within the chapter about what the Inquisition would do if it discovered the Shariax, which tells you something important. The Death Spectres expect that if the Inquisition learned a Space Marine chapter was using a Xenos artifact of unknown origin as their primary command structure, and had been doing so for 7,000 years, the response would not be sympathetic. The Inquisition has a formal process for dealing with chapters that it considers compromised by Xenos influence, and that process is not gentle. The fact that a Xenos artifact of unknown origin sits at the center of the Death Spectres' entire power structure, that every chapter master they have ever had has been slowly consumed by it, and that the chapter is hiding all of this from the wider Imperium because they fear what would happen if it came out, raises questions that the lore does not answer, and perhaps cannot answer, without fundamentally changing what the Death Spectres are. What is the Shariax? Who made it? Why was it on Occludus? Was it placed there deliberately, knowing that someone would eventually find it? Who could have placed it there, and for what purpose? Is the power it grants genuinely used to contain the Ghoul stars? Or is it doing something else entirely that the Death Spectres themselves do not fully understand? Is the Emperor's vision that guided Corcatus to the Shariax evidence of the Emperor's plan working as intended? Or is it evidence that someone or something manipulated Corcatus into finding and activating an artifact that serves a purpose nobody in the Death Spectres has correctly identified? There is one more element of the Shariax that adds another layer to these already stacked questions. When the Megyear dies, the next Megyear is always the Messazar, the chapter's chief librarian. The reason for this is stated to be because the Shariax appears to require psychic sensitivity to function. It is technology that seems psyker-based, and so the most powerful psyker in the chapter is the one who ascends to the throne. This creates a chapter where the political and military leadership is always separate. The Megyear on the throne provides something essential and irreplaceable, while the practical running of the chapter falls to the council below, and the next Megyear is always the person who spends their career learning the arts of the mind, rather than the arts of command. The sword that Corcatus laid at the Emperor's feet on the day he received his vision, a relic force sword called Archimen, has become the chapter's most sacred weapon. After Corcatus took the Shariax, he passed the sword to the Messazar, and it has passed from chief librarian to chief librarian ever since, a chain of custody stretching back to the founding moment of the chapter, a weapon that carries within it the psychic echo of the Emperor's revelation. When the current Messazar Athiocordatus selected the codicier Leandro Caris for service with the Death Watch, he sent Archimon with him. A relic of thousands of years of history, sent out into the galaxy in the hands of a young librarian, for reasons that the Death Spectres' leadership felt were important enough to justify sending their most sacred artifact away from home. Section 7. The biology of the Death Spectres. Gene seed, mutations, and the body. The Death Spectres are sons of Corax, Ravengard's successors. And like all of Corax's sons, they carry the genetic burdens of their progenitor's imperfect gene seed, the flaws and mutations that have been present in the Ravengard since the Horus Heresy, when Corax attempted to accelerate the creation of new Marines using corrupted gene tech, and created warriors whose bodies were deeply wrong. But the Death Spectres, having emerged from the Dark Founding, with no official gene seed records, cannot even be certain of the full extent of what they are carrying. Their biology is partly known and partly obscure, and the mutations they express go beyond what you would normally expect, even from the already flawed Ravengard template. The most immediately visible effect of their gene seed is albinism. Every Death Spectre is an albino. Complete, total albinism, pale as bone, pale as the grave dust of Occludus, pale as something that has not seen sunlight in longer than it should have been alive. This is caused by a malfunction in the melanochrome organ, one of the 19 specialized biological implants that transform a human recruit into a space marine. The melanochrome is responsible for controlling melanin production in a marine's skin, adjusting pigmentation to protect against radiation and environmental hazards. In the Ravengard, this organ produces a different, but still functional result, eventually turning their warrior's skin pale and their hair and eyes dark. In the Death Spectres, the organ fails entirely. No melanin, no pigmentation, no color in the skin at all. When you first see a Death Spectre out of armor, the effect is striking in a way that goes beyond simple paleness. This is not the healthy pallor of someone from a cold climate or the fair skin of a northern world. This is the white of something drained, the white of parchment, of old bone, of things preserved rather than alive. And set against that total absence of pigment are their eyes. Their eyes glow red, blood red, the same red as their blood, which the lore explicitly notes as the comparison. This is another genetic mutation, a separate expression of the gene seed's instability layered on top of the albinism, and the combined effect is intensely unsettling. A warrior of enormous physical capability, encased in black armor, with skin the color of old ivory and eyes that burn crimson in the dark. These are warriors who look like something that should be in the horror they fight, not fighting it. The Death Spectres also lose their hair during the gene seed implantation process. Every recruit who survives the transformation, and the survival rate is low enough to be a constant problem for the chapter's numbers, emerges hairless. Though there are records of individual Death Spectres who manage to retain some hair, this is apparently uncommon enough to be noteworthy. Beyond the visible mutations, the Death Spectres have lost the function of two of the standard Space Marine organs entirely. The Becher's gland, which would allow a Marine to produce a corrosive acid in their saliva useful in close combat and emergencies, is simply absent in functioning form. The mucranoid, which would cause a Marine's skin to secrete a protective waxy coating in response to extreme environmental conditions, including vacuum exposure, is similarly non-functional. The Ravengard have also lost these organs, so the Death Spectres are inheriting the same deficit but compounding it with their additional albinism mutation. The loss of the mucranoid is worth noting specifically because it removes one of the emergency survival tools that a Space Marine normally carries. The mucranoid is what allows a Marine to survive vacuum exposure for short periods by sealing their skin. Without it, a Death Spectre in the void is slightly more vulnerable than a standard Space Marine, which, in the context of a chapter whose domain includes enormous stretches of space and void operations against enemies who build floating crystal cities in gas-giant atmospheres, is a relevant tactical consideration. But here is where something extraordinary about the Death Spectre's biology becomes apparent. Something that links their physical nature to their cultural practices and their philosophical relationship with death in a way that no other chapter can match. The Death Spectres have the ability to will themselves back from death. Not in the sense of extreme resilience, though they have that too, but in a more literal sense. Their initiation process, which we will examine in detail in a later section, requires aspirants to die, to reach clinical death by whatever means the trial imposes upon them, and then to return to life through pure acts of will. The fact that this is a repeatable, controllable process, that the chapter has built its entire initiation and promotion structure around the ability to die and come back, implies something unusual about the biology of Death Spectres, Marines, some interaction between their gene seed mutations and the kind of will-based consciousness that the Shariak seems to require of the Magir. There is an additional implication here that becomes relevant when considering the Primaris Space Marines. The Rubicon Primaris, the procedure by which a firstborn Space Marine crosses over and is transformed into a Primaris, is physically demanding and dangerous. It involves modifications to the Marine's existing biology and a period of extraordinary physical stress. The most dangerous moment of the process is essentially dying and coming back. For most Marines, this is a serious gamble. For a Death Spectre, willing themselves back from death is literally a trained skill they mastered before they were ever accepted into the chapter. The implication is that for a Death Spectre, the Rubicon Primaris would be easy, relatively speaking, because they have already done the hardest part many times over as part of their normal career advancement. The gene seed of the Death Spectres is not archived on Terra. The Dark Founding left no records. The Adeptus Mechanicus has no stored samples of Death Spectres' genetic material dating from the founding period, which means that if the chapter were destroyed, there would be no straightforward way to reconstitute it. This is a vulnerability that other chapters do not share to the same degree, and it is another reason why the Death Spectres' independence from the broader Imperium's support structures is both a point of pride and a quiet source of existential risk. Section 8. Culture, Beliefs, and the Art of Dying. There is a version of a relationship with death that is theatrical. That performs grief, or that aestheticizes mortality, or that makes death into a stage prop for a particular kind of dramatic self-presentation. Several Space Marine chapters have this quality. They carry skulls and dark heraldry, and speak in elevated language about the nobility of dying, but underneath that presentation is a fairly conventional military culture that treats death as something to be inflicted on enemies and avoided by the Brotherhood. The Death Spectres are not like this. Their relationship with death is not theatrical. It is not aesthetic. It is one of the most genuinely deep and structurally foundational aspects of their identity, woven into every part of how they operate and how they understand themselves and what they believe their purpose to be. Death is not a backdrop for the Death Spectres. It is the subject of the longest and most sustained study any institution in the Imperium has ever conducted. 7,000 years of direct and personal engagement with mortality in all its forms. Their central belief is stated simply and clearly in the available records. They hold as a core tenet that only those who die in battle will be reborn to fight again in the Emperor's service. This is not unusual as a belief system among Space Marines. The idea that fallen warriors go on to some form of continued existence, that the sacrifice of the battlefield is not the end but a transformation, appears in many chapter cultures. But for the Death Spectres, this belief has been made literal. They have built their initiation around it. They have built their promotion system around it. They have made dying and returning a skill that every warrior in the chapter must demonstrate before they are considered truly part of it. The somber, deeply respectful quality of this relationship with death is an important distinction. Other chapters that embrace death as a theme can fall into something that is morbid or obsessive or performatively grim. The Death Spectres are compared more to the Star Phantoms than to the Mortifactors, and that comparison is instructive. The Star Phantoms are a chapter whose relationship with death is measured and serious and genuine, not decorative. They mourn, they honor, they remember, but they do not wallow. The Death Spectres share this quality. They do not celebrate death or seek it out for its own sake. They revere it. They treat it as sacred. They hold those who have died in battle with a respect that goes to the core of their theology and their identity. When a Death Spectre dies, if their body can be recovered, they are brought back to Occludus. There, they are mummified. Their preserved form is interred in the catacombs beneath Logopol, the fortress monastery that sits above the Temple of Voices and the Shariaks. So beneath the Shariax, which slowly turns each Megir to stone, there are the mummified remains of thousands of death specters going back to the chapter's founding, lying in the dark beneath a world of graves, in the quiet that the chapter believes is the proper resting place of warriors who have fulfilled their purpose. The heraldry of the chapter reflects this relationship directly. Black armor, as dark as the void between stars. One shoulder plate inset in white, bone pale, the color of old death. A helmet the color of ivory. The chapter icon is a skull behind crossed scythes, the visual vocabulary of mortality and the harvesting of lives made into a symbol that every death specter carries into battle. Their fortresses are decorated with these same motifs, sculptures and reliefs, and carved inscriptions covering every surface with language and imagery connected to death and transcendence. The passage from one state to another, the understanding that dying is not an ending. There is a gesture used within the chapter called the Masrahim, the salute of skull and throne. It is performed by placing the left hand, palm upward, next to the abdomen, and then placing the right hand, closed in a fist, into the palm of the left. The imagery is layered. The skull and the throne, death and rule, the seat of power that is also the seat of sacrifice, the gesture that acknowledges both the authority of the Megir on his Shariax and the death that authority requires. It is a salute, a sign of respect, and a reminder of the cost of leadership all compressed into a single physical movement. The language of the chapter draws on the Occlutan dialect of Low Gothic, the native tongue of Occludus, that the death specters have adopted and adapted over their centuries of habitation. Persian-influenced titles and terminology give the chapter's internal hierarchy a particular texture, a sound and feel that distinguishes it from other chapters and reinforces the sense of a culture that has evolved in genuine isolation from the rest of the Imperium. When a death specter says Megir or Mesazar or Menrahir, they are using words with specific resonance and meaning, vocabulary that carries the weight of thousands of years of chapter history. The Menrahir is the chapter council, the body of senior officers who handle day-to-day governance of the chapter, while the Megir sits on the Shariax. Only the first captain and the Mesazar have regular access to the Megir. Everyone else works through this council structure, which makes the Death Specters unusual among Space Marine chapters, in having a genuinely collective leadership arrangement, rather than the normal command structure where a single chapter master makes the decisions, and everyone else executes them. The first company of the Death Specters is known as the Wargeists, and they carry power scythes into battle. The scythe is not subtle as a symbol. It is the harvesting tool, the implement of the Reaper, the weapon that appears in every culture that has ever developed imagery around death as a figure. For the first company, the elite veterans of the Death Specters, to wield literal scythes in combat is the chapter's theology made into a weapon. These are warriors who have died and come back more times than anyone else in the chapter, who have faced death on more battlefields than can be counted, and who carry the symbol of death itself as they cut through whatever the ghoul stars throws at them. Section 9. The Initiation Trials. Dying to Live. Every Space Marine chapter has a process for recruiting and creating new warriors. There is always a period of testing, always a physical and psychological examination designed to find candidates who have the potential to survive the transformation that the gene seed implantation requires. This process is brutal by any ordinary standard, and it kills many of the candidates who attempt it. Only a fraction of those who begin the journey complete it. The Death Specters have this process, and then they have something else. The Death Specters require their aspirants to die, literally, clinically, measurably die, and then come back to life, not metaphorically, not as a near-death experience that leaves the aspirant shaken and enlightened. Actual death, vital signs ceasing, the body shutting down, and then, through nothing but willpower, the aspirant must restart themselves, must choose to come back, must reject the cessation of life through the force of their own determined will. The mechanism by which this is possible is not fully explained in the available lore. It seems to be connected to the gene seed mutations the Death Specters carry, to some interaction between their modified biology and the kind of consciousness that the modification creates. The fact that Space Marine biology is already dramatically different from human biology, that a Space Marine can survive injuries that would instantly kill any unaugmented person, that their secondary heart can maintain circulation when their primary heart fails, that their blood clotting ability is dramatically accelerated, that many of their systems have redundancies built in. All of this might contribute to a situation where death, for a Death Spectre aspirant, is a more reversible state than it would be for anyone else. But the lore also implies that pure will is a significant component. That the aspirant who survives this trial does not survive purely because their body eventually restarts itself. They survive because they refuse to stay dead, because they reach some threshold of awareness or determination, or simply stubborn refusal to accept that this is the end, and they come back from that threshold because they chose to. This has obvious and immediate philosophical resonance with everything else the Death Spectres believe. The central tenet that those who die in battle will be reborn is not merely a comforting myth in this chapter's culture. It is a demonstrable, repeatable fact of their biology and their psychology. Every Death Spectre has died. Every one of them has come back. The rebirth they promise to warriors who fall in the Emperor's service is not metaphor. They know what dying feels like. They know what coming back from it requires. They have done it. And it is not just aspirants who die. Promotion within the Death Spectres requires this trial to be repeated. Every time a Death Spectre advances in rank, they die again, and they come back again. The process is graduated, each repetition presumably more difficult or more demanding than the last, each one an affirmation that this warrior still has the capacity to choose life over death, that the will to serve has not dimmed, even after experiencing death and returning from it once, twice, a dozen times over the course of a career. The implications of this are remarkable. Consider what it means to lead this chapter into battle. Every officer above a certain rank has died multiple times, under controlled conditions, and returned through willpower. They have a relationship with their own mortality that is completely unlike anything a normal human commander could develop. They know what it feels like to stop. They know the threshold. They have been there. When they tell their warriors that those who die in battle will be reborn, they are not offering comfort. They are offering testimony. There is something else this practice creates in the Death Spectres, a quality that is hard to name, but easy to identify when you read accounts of them operating alongside other chapters. A stillness, a calmness in the face of threat that goes beyond trained tranquility, or the psychological distance that extended combat service can produce. The Death Spectres, who serve in the Death Watch, operating alongside warriors from dozens of other chapters, are consistently described as having a presence that is different in quality from what other chapter representatives bring. Not more aggressive, not more cold. Something more like acceptance, a fundamental peace with the fact of death that only comes from having been dead and having come back and having made that choice consciously. The aspirants for these trials must be found somewhere, and finding them in the Ghoul Stars is harder than finding them in the heavily populated interior of the Imperium. The Death Spectres are stationed beyond the frontiers of normal Imperial space. The worlds in their patrol zone are few, and those that have human populations are often under threat from the very things the Death Spectres are guarding against. Normal chapter recruitment from a fixed homeworld is not straightforwardly available, so the Death Spectres recruit differently. Section 10 Prime Stock, the breeding worlds. And the question nobody wants to ask. This is where the Death Spectres become uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond their surface-level strangeness. Because the solution they have developed to their recruitment problem is one of the most ethically ambiguous things any loyal Space Marine chapter does, something that sits in a gray area large enough to make you stop and think about what the word loyal actually means in the 40,000 universe. The Death Spectres call certain humans prime stock. These are individuals whose genetic profile, physical characteristics, and whatever other markers the chapter uses to evaluate potential, mark them as suitable material for producing Astartes aspirants. When the Death Spectres identify these individuals, they take them, not invite, not recruit, take. The chapter scouts human-inhabited worlds within the Ghoul Stars region, the sparse and isolated populations who have managed to survive in the vicinity of a zone of space that kills most things that wander into it. When they find someone who meets their criteria, that person is removed from their world, brought to Occludus, or to one of the worlds designated as breeding worlds in the Death Spectres' territory, and placed in a community of other selected individuals. These communities are then expected to produce future generations of children who might, eventually, prove suitable as aspirants for the chapter. The result is that the local human populations of the Ghoul Stars region regard the Death Spectres with the same fear and hostility they direct at the Necrons, which is a remarkable thing when you consider it. These people are being guarded by the Death Spectres, protected from the kinds of threats that would otherwise consume them completely, kept safe from xenos species that the Imperium has never successfully dealt with anywhere else. And yet they fear the Death Spectres more than they fear the monsters, because the monsters might come for them, but the Death Spectres definitely will. The lore treats this with some ambiguity. The Death Spectres see it as necessity, as the only practical solution to a logistical problem created by their posting at the edge of the galaxy, far from normal recruitment grounds. And in the context of the 40,000 universe, where the Imperium routinely does things that would be horrifying by any ordinary ethical standard, the Death Spectres' breeding worlds might not seem exceptional. But it is exceptional in a specific way. Space Marines have a complicated relationship with the populations they protect, but the relationship normally includes at least a nominal sense of duty toward those people. The Death Spectres explicitly state in their operational doctrine that their protection does not extend to the local humans in any meaningful sense. The chapter is charged with protecting the Imperium from the horrors of the Ghoul Stars, and that mandate operates at a strategic level. It is not about the individual worlds or the individual people living on them. If a world dies while the Death Spectres are otherwise occupied, or if saving it serves no broader strategic purpose, it dies. The Death Spectres have been known to let human worlds in the Ghoul Stars fall, if saving them would not serve the wider Imperium's interests. The short story Flayed by Cavan Scott shows this in action. A young woman named Alundra is taken from her world along with many others deemed prime stock. She is removed and relocated to a breeding world. Shortly after, the Death Spectres carry out an exterminatus on the planet they took her from, eliminating the world entirely because it had been too heavily infested by Necron-flayed ones to be worth saving. The people who were not selected as prime stock die when their world dies. The people who were selected were taken before that happened, which is presented as a kind of mercy, though it is a mercy that was applied using criteria that Alundra herself had no say in, and that saved her, only to place her in a community she did not choose, for a purpose she did not consent to. There are defenders of this practice who argue that the people on these worlds would have died anyway, eaten by flayed ones, or consumed by the Scythor fiends, or destroyed by whatever else lives in the Ghoul Stars. That being taken to a breeding world is survival, even if it is not the survival anyone would choose. That the Death Spectres' mission is so important, and their recruitment situation so constrained, that the ends justify the means. There are others who point out that this is exactly the kind of reasoning that bad things use to justify themselves throughout history, and that the 40,000 universe does not sanitize moral complexity just because everyone involved is fighting for the Imperium. What is certain is that this practice exists, that it is a structural feature of how the Death Spectres sustain themselves, and that it creates a relationship between the chapter and the people it technically protects that is strained at the best of times and openly hostile at the worst. The Death Spectres are out there, alone, doing something that no other chapter does, for reasons that they believe are genuinely necessary. Whether they are right about the necessity is one of the questions that the lore leaves open. Section 11. The enemies at the gate, Scyther fiends, Necrons, and the Unnamed. The Death Spectres spend 7,000 years guarding a border. On the other side of that border are things that need guarding against. And the enemies the Death Spectres face in the Ghoul Stars are some of the strangest, most disturbing, and most lore-opaque entities in the entire 40,000 setting. The Scythor fiends are the most documented of the Death Spectres' primary antagonists, which is not saying very much, because what is known about them raises more questions than it answers. They are described as xenos, alien creatures with a defined biological form, and the capacity for civilization, evident from the vast crystal fortress cities they build floating in the upper atmospheres of gas giants. They have technology sophisticated enough to construct these structures and maintain them in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. They have the social complexity to manage relationships with other alien species, embedding themselves in the power structures of the Borlak, the Loxatl, and the Nikasar as subtle manipulators, working their influence through those species without drawing direct attention to themselves. Their physical form is described as biomorphic, capable of change, and when their usual methods of persuasion and infiltration fail them, their battle form is recorded as horrifying to behold. The Death Spectres, who have been fighting them for millennia, have had opportunities to observe this battle form in detail, and the fact that they describe it in terms that suggest genuine horror rather than clinical tactical assessment is meaningful. These are warriors who have faced daemonkin and necron constructs and things from the deep void without apparent distress, and they find the Scythor Fiend's battle form disturbing. The most important thing the Death Spectres know about the Scythor Fiends, the thing that they told the Black Templars during the Ghoul Stars Crusade of 990, M41, is that the Fiends are not alive in any way that humans would understand the term. Not alive, and yet present, and yet active, and yet building and manipulating, and fighting, and withdrawing, and returning, something that operates in the spaces of existence that the word alive does not cover. Something deathless, perhaps, in the same way that the Pale Wasting's threat was described as that which cannot die. Their homeworld, the gas giant designated Gravecore, resisted exterminatus. The Black Templars threw everything at it. They bombarded it with fleet weaponry. They tried to ignite its atmosphere. None of it worked at the expected rate or with the expected results. The planet was resistant to damage in ways that should be impossible. Whether this is a property of the planet itself, of some technology the Scythor Fiends deployed there, or of whatever the Scythor Fiends fundamentally are, is not explained. And when the Death Spectres had assaulted Gravecore before the Black Templars arrived, as when the Black Templars arrived, they found the world empty. The Scythor Fiends had simply gone. No bodies, no wreckage, no evidence of the species having ever been there at all, beyond the Crystal Fortress cities floating in the toxic sky. And then, eventually, they came back. They always came back. Captain Narush of the Death Spectres told Helbrecht directly that whatever the Templars did to the gas giant, it would not matter in the long run, because the Scythor Fiends always return to reclaim their realm. This is the enemy the Death Spectres have been managing. Not defeating, not exterminating, but managing for 7,000 years. An enemy that cannot be killed in any conventional sense. An enemy that simply leaves when the pressure becomes too great and then returns when the pressure eases. An enemy that the Death Spectres understand well enough to know that containment is the best available strategy, and that total elimination is either impossible or something that has never yet been achieved. Then there are the Necron Flayed Ones associated with the Bone Kingdom of Drazak. The Flayed Ones are Necrons, ancient metal warriors of an empire 60 million years old, but they are Necrons who have been afflicted by the Flayer Curse, a psychological deterioration that drives them to remove flesh from living creatures and wrap themselves in it, to imitate the biological existence they lost when they chose to transfer their consciousness into deathless metal bodies. The Bone Kingdom is a gathering of these afflicted warriors, a kind of charnel court ruled over by a Necron lord who has allowed the Flayer Curse to consume most of what might once have been rational thought. Necron Flayed Ones are already among the more unsettling entities in the 40,000 universe. They are Necrons who have gone mad with grief for their biological existence. They wear the skins of the living because they remember, somewhere deep in whatever remains of their consciousness, what it felt like to be made of flesh. In the Ghoul Stars, these beings congregate in numbers larger than anywhere else in the known galaxy, gathered in their bone kingdom like a court of the permanently mourning, pursuing their awful imitation of life in the dark. The Death Spectres fight these things. They have been fighting these things for 7,000 years. And then, in the short story Flayed, we see what this looks like from the ground level, from the perspective of the people the Death Spectres are technically protecting, when Alundra watches her world be steadily consumed by Flayed Ones before the Death Spectres arrive, extract the Prime Stock, and burn the planet clean. From her perspective, the Death Spectres and the Flayed Ones are equally terrifying, equally alien, equally beyond her ability to understand or resist. The only difference is that the Death Spectres chose to save her for their own reasons, before ending everyone else. And then there are the things that do not have names. The lore describes creatures in the ghoul stars that have no established category in Imperial bestiary records. Entities that the Death Spectres fight in the dark and the cold, in the void between dying stars, on the surfaces of worlds that should not have anything moving on them. The records of these encounters are not widely available, partly because the Death Spectres' physical isolation means their battle reports reach the broader Imperium slowly and incompletely, and partly because what they describe strains the framework of categories that Imperial taxonomy provides for Xeno species. Whatever lives in the ghoul stars, it has been keeping the Death Spectres busy for 7,000 years. Section 12. The Great Resurrection and the Kadash Prophecy. Now we arrive at the element of the Death Spectres' lore that sits at the center of everything else and refuses to be explained. The Great Resurrection, the Kadash. The prophecy that the first Megir, Korkatus, carried with him from the moment of his vision at the Golden Throne, the prophecy that the chapter has been quietly working toward across its entire 7,000-year existence. The Great Resurrection is a prophesied event. Korkatus foretold it, connected it explicitly to the Throne of Glass and to the chapter's mission, and described it as the culmination of the Death Spectres' purpose, the moment when all their sacrifices would be made worthwhile. What the Great Resurrection actually is, what it involves, what it changes or creates or restores, is not stated in any record accessible to outsiders, but the name. The name is very specifically chosen. A resurrection is a return from death. Not a survival, not a near-death escape, but a return from actual death to life. The Death Spectres are a chapter whose warriors are trained to return from death as a standard part of their development. Their central theological belief is that those who die in battle will be reborn. Their chapter master dies slowly on a throne of alien glass, his physical form transitioning from living flesh to stone as the throne consumes him. And at the end of all of this, there is a prophesied event called the Great Resurrection. The question of who exactly is being resurrected in this prophecy is one that the Death Spectres either do not fully know themselves or are very carefully not saying. But in the broader context of Warhammer 40,000, in the era where the story exists, where the Golden Throne is failing and the Emperor's stasis is becoming increasingly unstable, and the question of whether the Emperor can or will return from his 10,000-year near death is one of the central unresolved tensions of the entire setting, the phrase Great Resurrection carries particular weight. There is a specific and pointed resonance between the Sheriax and the Golden Throne. Both are archaic seats of immense psychic power that drain and eventually destroy whoever sits on them. Both require the occupant to sacrifice themselves in a slow and total way to maintain a vital function that keeps something terrible at bay. Both result in the gradual petrification or transformation of the person on the throne. The Emperor on the Golden Throne maintains the Astronomicon and keeps the warp somewhat contained. The Megir on the Sheriax maintains something that the Death Spectres believe keeps the ghoul stars contained and the Imperium safe. Whether the Sheriax is connected to the Golden Throne in some deeper way, whether it is a piece of the same larger architecture, whether the vision that Korkatus received at the Golden Throne was the Emperor communicating something about the Sheriax because the two are related, these are questions that the lore raises and does not answer. The parallel is so explicit and so consistent in detail that it cannot be accidental. Someone, either the Death Spectres authors or the universe itself, is telling you that these two thrones are connected. In what way, and what that connection means for the Great Resurrection prophecy, remains one of the great open questions of this chapter's lore. The Kadash is the specific component required for the Great Resurrection to occur. Kadash translates to living chalice. It refers to a specific individual of great significance who, upon taking their place upon the Sheriax, will bring about the prophesied event. The Death Spectres' leadership has apparently been working throughout the chapter's entire history to bring about the Kadash's rise, sowing the seeds of fate across 7,000 years to ensure that the right person eventually exists and ends up in the right place. The fact that the Death Spectres' leadership believes they can shape fate across 7,000 years to produce a specific prophesied individual tells you a great deal about how they understand their mission. This is not a chapter that responds to events as they unfold. This is a chapter playing a very long game, one whose timeline extends from the founding moment at the Golden Throne to some future event that has not yet happened, and which is pursuing that endpoint with the patience and deliberate intention of an institution that has already waited 7,000 years and is prepared to wait as long as necessary. The Death Spectres librarian Leandro Carras, who serves with the Death Watch under the call sign Scholar, is explicitly mentioned in connection with the prophecy. The fact that the Messazar Atheo sent Archimon, the chapter's most sacred relic, with Carras when he was seconded to the Death Watch, suggests that Carras has a specific role in the chapter's plans. Whether Carras himself is the Kadash, or whether he is intended to find or create or facilitate the Kadash, is left undefined. But the weight of implication in the Steve Parker novels that feature him suggests that his story is not incidental to the Death Spectre's larger purpose. The Great Resurrection prophecy, if it connects to the Emperor's potential return, would make the Death Spectres one of the most significant factions in the 40,000 setting, a chapter that has been quietly preparing for the Emperor's rebirth for millennia, hidden at the edge of the galaxy, doing something essential that nobody else understands. That is a reading that the lore supports but does not confirm. And in a setting where confirmation is rare and deliberate ambiguity is a feature rather than a bug, the Death Spectre's prophecy is perhaps best understood as one of the great seeds of possibility that the creators have planted and left for the universe to eventually answer. Section 13. Notable campaigns and battle honors. Despite their isolation and their role as the permanent garrison of the Ghoul Stars region, the Death Spectres have not spent 7,000 years in pure stasis. They have emerged from their vigil repeatedly, participating in conflicts that touched even their remote corner of the galaxy, and occasionally being called upon by the broader Imperium for campaigns where their specific skills were needed. The Pale Wasting, as we have discussed, is the foundational event of their history. 11 chapters lost. The Nova Marines surviving and earning honors, the Imperium's response being the creation of the Death Spectres themselves. The chapter did not participate in the Pale Wasting, because they did not yet exist when it happened, but they were created in its direct aftermath, sent to prevent it from happening again. In a real sense, the Pale Wasting is the campaign that began the Death Spectre's story, even though they were not there for it. Their early history in the Ghoul Stars involved the long and difficult work of establishing their presence in a region of space that the Imperium had previously treated as fundamentally hostile to habitation, setting up the monitoring systems, establishing contact with or control over the human populations scattered through the region, finding Occludus, building Logopol, discovering the Sheriax. The first Megir, spending the early decades of the chapter's existence on the Throne of Glass, learning what it could do and what it required. None of this is chronicled in detail in any accessible source, which is appropriate. This was the quiet establishment of something that was always meant to operate in the shadows. In 140, M40, the Death Spectres fought in what is recorded as the Vern IV Offensive, a complex three-way conflict involving the chapter, the Drukhari Cabal of the Envenomed Thorn, and a warband of Aeldari corsairs known as the Void Dragons. The presence of multiple Aeldari factions alongside the Death Spectres in this conflict is interesting, though the details of what actually happened at Vern IV are not extensively documented. What it tells us is that the Death Spectres were ranging beyond the strict borders of the Ghoul Stars in this period, engaged in conflicts that drew multiple factions into the same theater of operations, and operating with the kind of tactical flexibility that their Ravenguard heritage would predict. The Macharian Crusade of 392 to 399, M41 saw the Death Spectres participating in one of the most significant Imperial military campaigns of the 41st millennium. Lord Commander Solar Macarius, the greatest Astra Militarum commander of his era, led a crusade that would eventually claim 1,000 worlds for the Imperium, pushing further and faster than any Imperial advance in living memory. The Death Spectres' participation in this crusade took them far from their usual zone of operation, which suggests either that the broader Imperium occasionally required their presence, or that the Death Spectres themselves saw opportunity in the crusade to advance their own purposes in ways that are not recorded in the public history of the campaign. In 995, M41, They were operating on the northeastern boundaries of the Imperium, alongside the Honored Sons chapter. Both forces engaged against the tendrils of Hive Fleet, Jormungandr. The Tyranids represent a categorically different kind of threat from the entities the Death Spectres normally face, being very much alive and very much driven by the overwhelming consumption of the Great Devourer. The Death Spectres, bringing their particular skills and knowledge to bear against a Hive Fleet, suggests a degree of versatility in their combat doctrine that their focus on the Ghoul Stars might cause people to underestimate. The 13th Black Crusade, in 999, M41, saw the Death Spectres field 6 entire companies against the forces of chaos. This is a significant commitment for any chapter, deploying more than half their total strength to a single campaign. They infiltrated the world of Lilithor to assist Astra Militarum regiments, seeking to retake that world from chaos occupation, conducting guerrilla raids and covert strikes that brought out the full expression of their Raven Guard heritage. 600 Death Spectres equipped for jump pack assault on a traitor stronghold, moving in the shadows, striking and withdrawing, picking apart an entrenched enemy with surgical precision. This is what they look like when they fight outside their normal operating theater, and it is impressive. The Ghoul Stars Crusade deserves extended discussion precisely because it reveals so much about the Death Spectres' relationship with the threat they contain. When High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars declared a crusade against the Scythor Fiends in 990, M41, the Death Spectres accompanied him, not as the primary force, not leading the crusade, but present, guiding, providing intelligence and expertise about an enemy they had been fighting for millennia while the Black Templars were encountering them for the first time. 8 years of brutal combat, the Scythor Fiends' outer systems falling one by one, the push toward Grave Core, the eerie silence of a deserted world, the failed exterminatus. The Death Spectres' quiet told you so, delivered with all the patience of a chapter that has run this exact scenario before and knows how it ends. The Scythor Fiends gone, the planet resistant, the mystery unresolved, and then Armageddon calling and the crusade abandoned. Captain Narush's statement that the Scythor Fiends would always return, that whatever the Black Templars did to their homeworld would not matter in the long run, was not pessimism. It was a report, an observation based on direct operational experience accumulated over centuries. The Black Templars had 8 years of experience with this enemy. The Death Spectres had several thousand. And what the Death Spectres had learned in those thousands of years was that there is no killing an enemy that is not alive. There is only containment. There is only the vigil. There is only the watch, continued day after day in the cold and the dark, because stopping is not an option. The operations that are not recorded publicly are perhaps more significant than the ones that are. The Death Spectres have, at some point before the 41st millennium, launched at least one major offensive campaign against the Scythor Fiends that ended the same way the Black Templars' crusade ended. They have fought Necron-flayed ones across the Ghoul Stars in engagements that produced no significant historical records accessible outside the chapter itself. They have apparently encountered and dealt with threats that do not have names in Imperial records. They have done this entirely alone, 7,000 years of warfare in the dark, and the vast majority of it simply happened without anyone outside the Ghoul Stars knowing it occurred. That is the nature of the Death Spectres' war. It is a war that the Imperium has officially outsourced and then tried to forget about, trusting that the albino warriors in black armor on the edge of the galaxy are handling things, and preferring not to think too hard about what things, specifically, they are handling. Section 14, the Leandro Karras stories, and the Deathwatch connection. One of the most valuable sources of Death Spectres lore is Steve Parker's series of stories following Deathwatch Kill Team Talon, particularly the Deathwatch novel and its sequel Shadowbreaker, along with several associated short stories. These books give the Death Spectres their most extensive literary treatment, showing the chapter from the inside in a way that official codex entries and campaign records cannot fully capture. Leandro Karras is a codicier, a mid-rank librarian of the Death Spectres. His call sign within Kill Team Talon is Scholar, which tells you something about how his teammates perceive him. He is bookish, thoughtful, analytical, a psyker of considerable ability, who approaches problems with a measured intelligence that distinguishes him from the more overtly aggressive warriors around him. He is also, from everything the lore implies, deeply significant to the Death Spectre's plans in ways he may or may not fully understand himself. The Messazar Otheochordatus, the Death Spectre's current chief librarian and de facto chapter master while the Megir sits dying on the Sheriax, is Karas's mentor. This relationship is important. The Messazar is the person who runs the chapter. The Messazar is also the person in line to become the next Megir, to sit on the Sheriax and begin the slow process of being consumed by it. The fact that the Messazar has selected Karas for the Death Watch and has sent the sacred sword Archimen with him suggests that the Messazar believes Karas's service with the Death Watch is connected to the chapter's larger purpose in some way that is not openly stated. Karas is described as experiencing significant development during his Death Watch service. He encounters things through Kill Team Talon that push the limits of his psychic ability and his philosophical framework. He works alongside Inquisitor Sigma, a mysterious figure whose interest in the kill team goes beyond normal operational requirements, and whose agenda intersects with the Death Spectre's prophecy in ways that remain deliberately unclear through the events of both novels. The Death Spectre's Death Watch Captain Harsid is another notable figure, currently leading his own kill team in collaboration with Inquisitor Talala Yazir of the Ordo Xenos. Harsid is hunting a series of dangerous Xenos artifacts that the Inquisitor believes have corrupted several high-ranking magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a thread of narrative that connects the Death Spectres to the broader pattern of Xenos artifact danger that is very much within their zone of expertise. They are the experts on Xenos entities that are not quite alive. Hunting Xenos artifacts that corrupt through contact is not far from what they normally deal with. The Steve Parker novels are significant for another reason. They are the source that explicitly confirmed the Death Spectre's Raven Guard heritage through a direct statement by a Death Spectre character. The broader lore around the chapter had maintained deliberate ambiguity about this, in keeping with Games Workshop's general policy of leaving Space Marine chapter origins somewhat uncertain. Parker simply had the character say it outright, cutting through the institutional vagueness with a direct piece of information that fans had been inferring from the gene seed mutations for years. This is worth noting because it illustrates something about the Death Spectres as a lore entity. Much of what makes them interesting is precisely the careful balance between what is stated and what is implied. The Sheriax's power, the Great Resurrection, the Kadash, the connection to the Pale Wasting, all of these things are described in terms that make you understand that something enormously significant is going on, without ever fully explaining what that significance is. And when an author breaks through that deliberate vagueness with a direct statement, as Parker did with the Raven Guard heritage, it feels like sunlight through a window in a very dark room, illuminating, but also reminding you of how dark the rest of the room still is. Section 15. The Question of the Inquisition. There is a detail in the Death Spectre's lore that is easy to miss, but carries enormous implications when you stop to think about it. The chapter is worried about what the Inquisition would do if it discovered the Sheriax. That worry is not abstract. It is not a general concern about maintaining operational security. It is a specific fear that the Inquisition's response to the discovery that a Space Marine chapter has been using a Xenos artifact of unknown origin as their command structure for 7,000 years would be in a way the chapter could not survive. The Inquisition's relationship with Space Marine chapters is complicated. On paper, the Inquisition has the authority to investigate any element of the Imperium, including Space Marine chapters, and can recommend extraordinary measures against institutions found to be compromised. In practice, Space Marine chapters have enough political weight, military capability, and institutional prestige that even the Inquisition approaches them carefully. Declaring a Space Marine chapter excommunicate traitoris is not a decision any Inquisitor makes lightly. But a chapter whose chapter master is dying on a Xenos throne. A chapter that has been hiding this from the Imperium for 7,000 years. A chapter that has no gene seed records in the Imperial Archive. A chapter stationed beyond the borders of normal Imperial space. These are, individually and collectively, the kind of red flags that would generate serious, inquisitorial attention if they were discovered together. The Death Spectre's own assessment of the risk suggests they have thought carefully about what the Inquisition's response would look like, and they have concluded it would be bad enough to warrant hiding the Shariax's existence as their most closely guarded secret. This implies that the chapter believes it could not simply explain the Shariax to the Inquisition and be believed, that the story of the founding vision, the alien throne, the great resurrection, the 7,000 years of sacrifice, would not be enough to satisfy an Inquisition that found evidence of Xenos artifact use at the highest levels of chapter command. Whether this fear is justified depends on which Inquisitors you imagine discovering the secret. There are Inquisitors in the 40,000 universe who are pragmatic enough, open-minded enough, or simply wise enough to understand that the galaxy is full of necessary compromises and that 7,000 years of loyal service at the edge of the galaxy deserves significant benefit of the doubt. And there are Inquisitors who would see Xeno's artifact, dying chapter master, 7,000 years of secrecy, and reach for the most extreme response available. The Death Spectres have calculated the risk and chosen secrecy. Whether that is the right choice is another of those questions the lore refuses to definitively answer. Section 16. The connection to the Golden Throne, the theory that refuses to go away. Let us be clear about something. What follows is analysis of implications, not confirmed lore. The connection between the Shariax and the Golden Throne is not stated as fact by any official source. It is an inference drawn from the accumulation of parallels that the lore presents, and it is an inference that serious students of Death Spectre's lore keep arriving at independently. The Golden Throne on Terra is an ancient piece of technology, partly human and partly alien in origin, that sustains the Emperor's physical form while channeling his consciousness into the Astronomicon and into the psychic wards that seal the warp. It was built partly from archaeotech that predates the Imperium, and partly from technology the Emperor himself designed during the Dark Age of technology. It requires constant attention from the Mechanicus to prevent its failure, and it is failing anyway, slowly, decade by decade, its ancient mechanisms wearing out in ways that human or Mechanicus technology cannot fully repair. The Emperor sits on the Golden Throne. He is sustained by it. He is also slowly consumed by it, his physical form degraded over millennia to the point where it can no longer function without the throne's support. He communicates rarely, and when he does, only through the most sensitive psychic individuals, the custodians, certain psychers, the occasional space marine who gets close enough. In exchange for this sacrifice, he maintains the Astronomicon, keeps the warp's worst terrors somewhat in check, and preserves the possibility that the Imperium continues to exist. The Shariax is an alien throne that sustains its occupants' psychic capabilities, while slowly draining and petrifying them. The Megir sits on it. He is sustained by it as a psychic amplifier. He is also slowly consumed by it, his physical form transforming from living flesh to stone over the years of his tenure. He communicates rarely, and when he does, only with the first captain and the Messazar. In exchange for this sacrifice, the chapter maintains its vigil over the Ghoul stars, and the Death Spectres believe that without this sacrifice, the Imperium would be gravely threatened. Both thrones drain and eventually kill their occupants. Both thrones grant immense psychic power in exchange for that drain. Both thrones appear to serve some essential function of containment or support that makes the sacrifice seem worthwhile to those who sit upon them and to those who rely upon them. The Emperor's vision that led Corcatus to the Shariax was apparently specific and detailed enough to direct him to a particular cavern on a particular world at a particular time, which suggests that the Emperor knew the Shariax was there, which suggests that the Emperor had some relationship with or knowledge of the Shariax that predated the 13th founding. The Great Resurrection prophecy, in this reading, is about the Emperor. The Death Spectres have been running a parallel version of the Emperor's self-sacrifice on the Shariax for 7,000 years, learning from it, understanding it, preparing the conditions for the moment when the Kadash, the living chalice, takes the Shariax, and through it somehow facilitates the Emperor's return. Every Megir who has turned to stone on the throne of glass has been part of this preparation. Every century of vigil over the Ghoul stars has been part of it. The Death Spectres are not just guardians of a border. They are, if this reading is correct, the quiet architects of the Emperor's resurrection. This is speculation. It is informed speculation, drawn from genuine parallels in the lore, but speculation nonetheless. The Death Spectres writers have planted these seeds carefully and have not confirmed where they lead. In a setting that is deliberately built on unanswered questions and long narrative arcs that span decades of publication history, the Death Spectres prophecy might be resolved in some future book or game supplement, or it might remain forever in the productive ambiguity that makes it compelling. What is not speculation is that the Death Spectres lore is constructed around these parallels in a way that clearly intends for the reader to notice them. The connection between the Sheriax and the Golden Throne is not accidental. Whatever the exact nature of that connection, it is there, built into the chapter's history, and it makes the Death Spectres something more than an obscure chapter doing a difficult job at the edge of the galaxy. It makes them possibly central to the most important question in all of Warhammer 40,000. Section 17 Unanswered Questions, and Why Nobody Can Explain Them. We have covered an enormous amount of ground. The Ghoul Stars, the Pale Wasting, the Dark Founding, the Sheriax, the Great Resurrection, the Kadash, the Breeding Worlds, the Scythor Fiends and their impossible homeworld, the albino warriors in black armor, who have been standing watch in the dark for 7,000 years. And yet, having covered all of this, we arrive at the place where the title of this video comes from, because after all of this, the Death Spectres remain a chapter that nobody can fully explain. The questions that remain are not minor details. They are the structural pillars of the entire chapter's existence. Nobody can explain the Sheriax. What is it? The lore says Xenos artifact, unknown origin. But in a setting where we know a great deal about the kinds of things that can produce artifacts of this scale and capability, unknown origin is a remarkable absence. The Necrons have built similar things. The old ones built things on this scale. Something from before recorded history built the Sheriax and left it on Occludus, and either it was placed there deliberately for someone to find, or it was there by accident, waiting for Corcatus to show up. Both of those possibilities are profoundly strange. Nobody can explain the Emperor's vision. Corcatus stood at the Golden Throne, laid his sword down, and received precise instructions to go to a specific world and find a specific cavern. The Emperor communicated the Sheriax to the first Megir, which means the Emperor knew the Sheriax was there. What did the Emperor know about the Sheriax? Why did he want a chapter master sitting on it? What is the connection between the Sheriax and the Golden Throne that the Emperor understood well enough to guide an entire chapter to it through a vision? Nobody can explain the Dark Founding's records. Where are they? Why do they not exist? Is the absence of records the result of deliberate suppression, accidental loss, or something more active? Some entity that had reason to ensure that the origins of certain chapters were not documented? The Pale Wasting's records were deliberately destroyed. Is the Dark Founding's absence connected to that same decision, or is it a separate act of concealment? Nobody can explain what the Pale Wasting actually was. A plague, nightmare engines. 11 chapters destroyed, that which cannot die. The Nova Marines chronicles are empty of all reference to it, despite it being one of their earliest battle honors. What was it? What came out of the Ghoul Stars and consumed 11 entire chapters? The Scythor Fiends are present in the Ghoul Stars and match the not alive description, but are they capable of destroying 11 Space Marine chapters? Are the Thexians? Or was the Pale Wasting something else entirely? Something that was dealt with in such a way that whatever dealt with it decided the method should never be recorded. Nobody can explain the Scythor Fiends' technology, a planet resistant to exterminatus. Crystal cities floating in gas giant atmospheres, an entire species that can vanish without a trace when threatened and reappear when the threat is gone. What are they? Not alive, but functioning, capable of building and manipulating and fighting, masters of infiltration and influence, in possession of technology that can resist the most destructive weapons in the Imperial arsenal. Where do they come from? Are they related to any other entity in the 40,000 universe? Or are they something genuinely unique? Nobody can explain the Great Resurrection. What is it? When will it happen? Who is the Kadash? Is Karis the Kadash? Or is he the means by which the Kadash is found or created? What does the Great Resurrection actually entail, practically speaking? If it involves the Emperor's return, what role does the Shariax play in that? If the Megir's sacrifice on the Shariax is part of the preparation for the Emperor's resurrection, does that mean the Emperor knew, from the moment he gave Corcatus the vision, that he would need something the Death Spectres would eventually provide? These questions are not failures of the lore, they are the lore. The Death Spectres writers have constructed a chapter around productive incomprehensibility, a faction whose purpose and nature resists complete explanation, because the full explanation would require answering questions about the setting's deepest mysteries. They are a chapter defined by what they guard, and what they guard is the unknown. And a chapter defined by the unknown cannot, by definition, be completely explained. That is why, when you say the Death Spectres are the chapter nobody can explain, you are not criticizing the lore for being incomplete. You are identifying the most distinctive thing about them. They are the enigma that guards the enigma. They are the mystery that stands between the Imperium and the deeper mystery of the Ghoul Stars. They watch something that nobody fully understands from a world built over something nobody fully understands, led by a man slowly turning to stone under the influence of something nobody fully understands, working toward a prophecy that nobody fully understands. And they have been doing this for 7,000 years, alone, without complaint, without explanation, with only the patience of warriors who have died and come back enough times to know that some things simply take as long as they take. Section 18. What the Death Spectres tell us about Warhammer 40,000. There is a reason to care about the Death Spectres that goes beyond the specific details of their lore. Because the Death Spectres, in their combination of strangeness and devotion, of secret-keeping and sacrifice, of mystery and mission, are in some ways the most concentrated expression of what makes Warhammer 40,000 as a setting so uniquely resonant. The Imperium of Man is not a good place. It is a place that survives through enormous suffering, through the constant sacrifice of human lives and human dignity and human potential to keep something vast and imperfect and deeply flawed from collapsing entirely. The things the Imperium does to survive, the things it demands of its citizens and its soldiers, are terrible in ways that the setting does not flinch from. And yet the people doing these terrible things are, in many cases, genuinely trying to protect something worth protecting, genuinely sacrificing themselves for a cause they believe in, genuinely doing what needs to be done in an impossible situation. The Death Spectres embody this tension completely. Their breeding worlds are a moral problem. Their willingness to let human populations die when saving them serves no strategic purpose is a moral problem. Their secrecy about the Shariax, even from institutions with a legitimate interest in the information, is a moral problem. And yet, they have been standing watch at the edge of the galaxy for 7,000 years, dying and coming back, sitting their leaders on a throne that turns them to stone, fighting enemies that cannot be killed, guarding a border that the rest of the Imperium would rather pretend is not there. What is the right way to evaluate a force that does genuinely necessary things in ways that are genuinely troubling? What do you owe an institution that has protected you from something you do not know about and would never choose to understand? These are the questions that the 40,000 setting asks through the Death Spectres, and it asks them without providing clean answers, because clean answers to questions this deep would be false. The Death Spectres also tell us something about the scale of 40,000's history. 7,000 years. That is not a long campaign or a generational conflict. That is an institution so old that its founding is ancient history, its first chapter master, a figure as remote in time from the current chapter as Romulus is from modern Rome. And yet the Death Spectres' purpose has not changed. The Ghoul Stars are still there. The Scythor Fiends still return. The Megir still sits on the Shariax. The chapter still watches. In a universe of 10,000 years of perpetual war, the Death Spectres represent a specific kind of patience that few other factions can claim. Not the patience of waiting for the right moment to strike. The patience of knowing that the vigil must continue regardless of whether anything happens. That the value of the watch is not in what it catches, but in what it prevents. And that prevention is invisible and thankless and never ends. They are, in this sense, the most honest servants of the Imperium in the entire setting. They do a job that nobody acknowledges, in a place nobody wants to think about, for reasons that they cannot explain, at a cost that they pay in full, generation after generation, with no expectation of recognition. The Death Spectres do not get parades. They do not get statues in the Imperial Palace, or if they do, those statues are in corridors that very few people walk. They get the cold and the dark, and the graves of Occludus, and the slow stone death of every chapter master who has ever led them. And they keep doing it, closing the Silent Guardians. There is something deeply human about the Death Spectres, despite everything. Despite the albino skin, and the red eyes, and the gene seed mutations, and the alien throne, and the prophecy, and the 7,000 years of impossible duty. Because what drives them is recognizable. The belief that what they are protecting matters. The willingness to sacrifice, not in a sudden dramatic moment, but in the slow, sustained way that is so much harder. The faith maintained across millennia, that the vigil has meaning, and that the prophecy will be fulfilled, and that all of it will, in the end, have been worth it. They are warriors who have died and come back and died again and come back again, who have made their peace with death so completely that they use it as a training tool and a promotion requirement, and who face the darkest corner of the galaxy with an equanimity that comes not from indifference, but from the deepest possible understanding of what is at stake. The Death Spectres are the chapter nobody can explain, because the explanation would require you to know the answers to the setting's deepest questions. But they are also the chapter that, the longer you look at them, the more you feel the weight of their purpose. They are holding something back. They have always been holding something back. And whatever that something is, they believe it is important enough to sacrifice everything for, generation after generation, in the dark, alone, without asking whether anyone is watching, or whether anyone knows, or whether anyone appreciates it. They are albino warriors in black armor, standing at the edge of the galaxy, and they do not need you to understand them. They just need you to leave them to their vigil. If you have made it to the end of this one, honestly, thank you. The Death Spectres are one of those chapters where the deeper you go, the more you find, and I hope you found something that surprised you tonight. If you have your own theories about the Shariax, the Kadash, the Great Resurrection, or what exactly the Pale Wasting actually was, please drop them in the comments. I genuinely want to see where your thinking goes with this one, because the lore leaves enough space for some really compelling interpretations. Drop a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if this is the kind of thing you want more of. We have plenty more deep dives like this one coming, and the Warhammer 40,000 universe has no shortage of dark corners to explore. Sleep well. The Death Spectres are watching. End of script. Extended section. The Raven Guard Heritage. Sons of Korax in the Dark. To understand what kind of warriors the Death Spectres are in battle, it helps to go back to where they came from. The Raven Guard are one of the original 20 Space Marine legions, the sons of the Primarch Korax, whose name means the Raven in the dialect of his homeworld Deliverance, a world formerly called Lycaeus before the uprising of its enslaved population freed it. Korax himself is one of the most philosophically complex Primarchs, a warrior who became a liberator who became a weapon, a man who believed in the fundamental worth of those he fought for, even as the institution he served turned that belief into something increasingly difficult to maintain without compromise. The Raven Guard's tactical identity is built around concealment, patience, and striking, at precisely the right moment with precisely the right amount of force. They are not a legion of overwhelming power. They are a legion of overwhelming precision. Where other chapters might bring an assault cannon to a problem, the Raven Guard would spend 3 times as long making sure they knew exactly where to point it before pulling the trigger. Where other chapters would press an advantage by throwing more warriors at it, the Raven Guard would identify the exact point at which the enemy's defensive structure was weakest and hit that point so hard that the rest of the structure collapsed on its own. This tactical philosophy lives in the Death Spectres' DNA. When they deployed 6 companies during the 13th Black Crusade, they did not deploy them as a hammer blow. They deployed them as 1,000 perfectly aimed scalpels, infiltrating Lelithar, conducting guerrilla raids against chaos positions, picking apart a traitor stronghold from within, rather than breaking down its walls from without. This is Raven Guard doctrine, expressed in Death Spectres' execution, the art of the precise strike applied to a war zone in which direct confrontation would have been catastrophically expensive. The Raven Guard's gene seed carries particular burdens. The Horus heresy damaged Korax's gene seed, in ways that have reverberated through 10,000 years of successor chapters. During the heresy, Corax tried to accelerate the reconstruction of his legion after catastrophic losses at Istvan by using recovered genetic material of questionable integrity. The result was warriors whose physical forms were wrong in disturbing ways, creatures that looked like space marines but were not, that had to be destroyed by Corax himself in one of the most personally devastating acts of the entire heresy period. Even after those failed experiments were ended, the shadow of that genetic damage remained in the Raven Guard's seed, producing the mutations that all their successors carry. For the Death Spectres, inheriting the Raven Guard's legacy means inheriting the albinism and the missing organs. But it also means inheriting something less tangible, a chapter culture that values patience, intelligence, and the long view over aggression and glory-seeking. The Raven Guard are not a legion that produces warriors who charge screaming into enemy formations. They produce warriors who spend twice as long preparing as fighting, who are comfortable in the shadows, who understand that the most effective action is often the one the enemy never sees coming and never fully understands after it has happened. 7,000 years of operating alone in the Ghoul Stars has deepened these tendencies considerably. The Death Spectres have become, through centuries of isolation and the specific pressures of their mission, something that goes beyond even the Raven Guard in their patience and their willingness to operate on timescales that would seem incomprehensible to other chapters. The Raven Guard think in terms of campaigns. The Death Spectres think in terms of millennia. When Messazar Cordatus sends Karis to the Death Watch carrying Archiman and speaks of sowing the seeds of fate, he is expressing a strategic perspective that encompasses centuries of careful preparation and expects centuries more before the harvest arrives. The Raven Guard also have a particular relationship with mortality that the Death Spectres have inherited and transformed. Corax was a survivor. His entire legion was nearly wiped out at Istvan, reduced from tens of thousands to a handful. The recovery from that massacre defined the legion's post-heresy character in profound ways. You do not survive what the Raven Guard survived without developing a very particular relationship with the fact that you could have died and did not, that others did die in your place, that the dead deserve to be remembered, and the living deserve to be used to their fullest possible purpose. The Death Spectres have taken this instinct and built it into their initiation, into their promotion structure, into their theology. They have made what the Raven Guard experienced as a historical trauma into an ongoing, repeatable, controllable spiritual practice. What also distinguishes the Raven Guard and their successors is a philosophical orientation that is remarkably unusual for warriors who spend most of their lives killing things. The Raven Guard, shaped by Corax and by the history of deliverance, retains something that you might almost call a conscience. They are not naive about what war requires, but they have a framework that extends beyond pure tactical consideration. For the Death Spectres, cut off from the people of the broader Imperium for so long, this has evolved into something more internal and more abstract, a devotion to the mission itself rather than to the specific humans the mission is meant to protect. The breeding world situation is perhaps the clearest expression of this evolution. They do what the mission requires, even when what the mission requires sits uncomfortably alongside the liberator legacy of their genetic father. Extended section: the Fortress of Logopol and the World of the Dead. Occludus is not a world that many people choose to visit voluntarily, and those who do find themselves visiting involuntarily tend to leave changed in ways that are difficult to articulate. It is a cemetery world, which in the 40,000 universe means a world whose primary function and characteristic is the keeping of the dead. Not a charnel house in the crude sense, not a place where bodies are simply disposed of, but a world consecrated to the preservation of memory, to the careful and deliberate maintenance of the record of those who have died. The surface of Occludus is given over almost entirely to graveyards, not in the way that a single city cemetery might occupy a corner of a planet. On Occludus, the graveyards are the geography. They extend in every direction, as far as anyone can see, row after row of markers and monuments, tombs and cenotaphs, mausoleums of carved stone bearing the mummified remains of Death Spectres warriors going back thousands of years. The world is a monument to the dead, and it has been one since the Death Spectres arrived and made it so. There is something genuinely peaceful about the way this world is described in available sources, which is remarkable for a world that is simultaneously the headquarters of a chapter constantly at war with some of the most disturbing entities in the galaxy. The Death Spectres find comfort in the quiet of the grave fields. They walk among the dead, and they feel something that visitors would struggle to identify as anything other than peace, a sense of belonging to a long line of service that stretches back to the beginning of their history. For a chapter that has made death into a spiritual practice, a homeworld that is essentially one enormous resting place for the honored dead, is not grim. It is correct. The fortress monastery of Logopol rises from this grave field like something that grew up from the dead soil itself, a structure that is part military installation and part cathedral and part necropolis. Its walls carved with the imagery of death and transcendence that defines the chapter's aesthetic vocabulary. It has been added to over the centuries, each generation of death specters, leaving their mark on the structure. The whole thing reads like an archaeological record of the chapter's history, the oldest stones bearing the simplest designs, the newer sections showing the evolution of the death specter's visual language across millennia. The name Logopol itself carries meaning. It draws from the Greek word logos, meaning word or reason, or the ordering principle behind reality, and polis, meaning city. The word city, the city of reason. Given that it sits above the Temple of Voices, above the Shariax where the voices of dead Magirs may or may not resound across the ages, the name is not incidental. This is not just a fortress. It is a place where something is being said, in some frequency or register, that the Death Spectres understand and the rest of the Imperium does not. Beneath Logopol, in the catacombs honeycombing the rock under the fortress, are the mummified dead. Thousands of Death Spectres, preserved and interred in the dark beneath their homeworld, lying in the silence that the chapter believes is the proper resting state of warriors who have fulfilled their purpose. The mummification process is theological. The preserved form is a vessel, a physical anchor for the memory of that warrior's service. The dead of the Death Spectres are not gone. They are present, in the dark, in their preserved forms, witnesses to the continuing vigil of those who came after them. Below the catacombs, below even the deepest levels of the fortress monastery's structure, is the Temple of Voices. This ancient dome, predating the Death Spectre's arrival by an unknown length of time, predating the Imperium itself, is the heart of Occludus in a way that the surface of the planet simply is not. This is where the Shariax sits. This is where the Megir slowly turns to stone. This is where the real business of the Death Spectres is conducted in silence and darkness, and the gathering power of an alien artifact, older than human civilization. The name Temple of Voices implies multiplicity, not one voice, but many, either in sequence across the centuries as each Megir adds his dying imprint to those of his predecessors, or in some more simultaneous sense that the physics of the Shariax might allow, all the Megirs who have ever sat upon it somehow present together in the space the throne creates. If the Shariax retains the psychic imprint of every person who has died upon it, then what the current Megir channels through the throne is not merely his own power. He channels the collected voices of all who came before, contributing his life to a growing reservoir that has been building for 7,000 years. That reading makes the Temple of Voices aptly named, and it makes the Shariax something stranger and more significant than a mere amplifier. It makes it a vessel, a chalice, which is, intriguingly, exactly what the word Kadash means. Extended section isolation and its costs. There is no other chapter in the 40,000 universe that has been as consistently and completely isolated as the Death Spectres for as long as they have been isolated. 7,000 years, without meaningful access to the broader Imperium's resources or community. 7,000 years of fighting enemies that the rest of the Imperium does not acknowledge. 7,000 years of making decisions alone, because the Astronomican's marginal reach in the Ghoul stars makes reliable communication with distant authorities essentially impossible. What does this do to an institution? In the short term, isolation builds resilience. It forces you to develop solutions to your problems, rather than waiting for external help. The Death Spectre's breeding world system is a direct result of isolation. They could not get recruits from established Imperial worlds, so they built their own recruitment system from the materials available. They could not rely on supply chains from distant forge worlds, so they maintained and repaired their own materiel. They could not call for reinforcement when things got bad, so they developed combat doctrines calibrated for the permanent assumption that what they had was everything they were going to get. In the medium term, isolation produces distinctiveness. The Death Spectres' culture, their language, their rituals, their relationship with death, these things developed in isolation from the cross-pollination that Space Marine chapters in the Imperium's interior experience constantly. When you are stationed alongside 3 other chapters and rotating through joint operations with the broader Astra Militarum and interacting with the Mechanicus on a regular basis, your culture is constantly pushed and pulled and shaped by all of those interactions. When you are stationed alone for 7,000 years, your culture goes in whatever direction the pressures of your specific situation push it. In the long term, isolation can become its own kind of identity. The Death Spectres do not simply operate without Imperium support. They have come to expect operating without it, to build their entire institutional character around the assumption of self-sufficiency. When they emerge from the Ghoul Stars to participate in broader Imperial campaigns, they function effectively but differently from chapters that regularly operate alongside other Imperial forces. Their instinct is for the small, precise, self-sufficient strike, the operation that requires only what they can carry and relies only on what they themselves can do. The psychological dimension is one that the chapter's culture has developed very specific tools to manage. Isolation at the edge of the galaxy, fighting enemies that the rest of the Imperium does not believe are real, maintaining a vigil that may or may not be connected to something essential about the Emperor's survival. These are pressures that would test any institution's psychological coherence. Other chapters have the validation of external recognition. The Death Spectres have none of that. Their battles happen in the dark, unwitnessed. The Death Spectres survive these pressures because their relationship with death has given them a framework for meaning that does not depend on external validation. They do not need the Imperium to acknowledge their sacrifice. They do not need other chapters to recognize their service. They have the vigil, and they have the prophecy, and they have the Sheriacs, and the graves of Occludus, and the voices of their dead, and that is enough. It has to be enough, because in the Ghoul Stars, at the edge of the known galaxy, enough is all there is, and they have carried it for 7,000 years without breaking. Extended section The Era Indomitus. The vigil continues in the dark. The Great Rift changed everything for the Imperium, and it changed the Death Spectre situation in specific and acute ways. The rift tore through the middle of the galaxy, creating Imperium Nihilus, the blinded half-cut off from the Astronomicon. The Ghoul Stars sit in the extreme northeast of Ultima Segmentum, which places them squarely within Imperium Nihilus. If the Death Spectre's communication with the broader Imperium was difficult before the rift, it is now essentially impossible in any reliable sense, more alone than they have ever been. Operating in a region of space that is simultaneously more dangerous, as the opened rift has destabilized warp travel and emboldened the forces of chaos across the galaxy, and more isolated, as the routes that connected even the distant Ghoul Stars to the rest of the Imperium have become impassable or unreliable. And yet the lore states explicitly that even with the Great Rift yawning wide in the Era Indomitus, the Death Spectres continue their vigil. Their thankless duty remains. They are still out there, still watching, still fighting whatever comes out of the Ghoul Stars, still maintaining the Megir on the Shariacs and the mummified dead in the catacombs of Logopol. The Great Rift has not ended their watch. It has made it harder, and quieter, and darker. But it continues. This is either a testament to the chapter's extraordinary resilience, or evidence that their mission is so important that stopping is simply not an option, regardless of external circumstances. Given everything we know about the Sheriacs and the Great Resurrection prophecy, the latter seems more consistent. And in the Era Indomitus, with the galaxy split open and the Emperor's situation on the Golden Throne increasingly precarious, the moment when they believe their vigil is most essential may be arriving at last. There is a version of this story that is almost unbearably lonely. The Death Spectres, in the great dark age of the galaxy's worst crisis since the Horus Heresy, operating in the blackest and most remote corner of a galaxy that is currently tearing itself apart. No reinforcement coming, no acknowledgement, no way to know whether the Imperium they are protecting still exists in the form they remember. Just the vigil and the Shariaks, and the graves, and the deathless enemies on the other side of the border, and the prophecy, still unfulfilled, still waiting, still pulling them forward toward a future that 7,000 years of preparation has been building toward. If there is any faction in all of Warhammer 40,000 that deserves to be the key to the setting's resolution, the Death Spectres have earned it. They have paid the price in full, repeatedly, across 7 millennia, in the dark, without anyone watching or knowing or caring. If the Great Resurrection is real, if the Kadash comes and the Shariaks delivers whatever it has been building toward, if the Death Spectres turn out to have been doing something quietly essential all along, it would be one of the most satisfying resolutions in a setting that rarely resolves anything cleanly, and it would be completely in keeping with the character of the chapter. They do not seek recognition. They do not need to be understood. They just need to be left to their vigil, to their slow and certain work at the edge of everything, carrying out the oldest and most important duty in the Imperium without asking whether anyone knows they are doing it. They are the watchers at the wall, the guardians of the gap, the albino warriors in black armor, who stood in the cold long enough that the cold became their home. And they will stand there still, for as long as standing is required, in the silence where the Astronomicon barely reaches, and the ghoul stars breathe in the dark. Extended section: the Thexians, the manipulation masters, and the true face of the Pale Wasting. When we talk about the Pale Wasting, we inevitably circle back to the question of who, or what, was actually responsible for it. The records were destroyed deliberately. The Nova Marine's own chronicles pretend the campaign never happened, despite it being one of their oldest battle honors. 11 chapters were consumed by whatever came out of the ghoul stars during the Nova Terra Interregnum. And in the aftermath, the Imperium created a whole new founding specifically to guard against it happening again. That level of response implies a level of threat that the official record, sparse as it is, does not quite capture. You do not create a permanently stationed chapter, send them beyond the Imperium's borders, and charge them with an eternal vigil against a threat that has already been dealt with and is not expected to resurface. You do that for something you believe will come back, something you believe is still out there, something you understand, at a fundamental level, cannot be finally killed. The Thexians are one of the candidates for what the Pale Wasting actually was. They are a biomorphic species, capable of altering their physical form to suit circumstances, small in number but devastatingly effective at infiltrating and redirecting other civilizations. They have embedded themselves in the power structures of the Borlak, the Loxatl, and the Nikasar, 3 distinct alien species, operating within each of those civilizations as unseen influencers, steering events toward goals that serve Thexian purposes rather than the interests of the species they have infiltrated. The Thexians hail from the iron-oxidized worlds called the Blood Moons of Thex Prime, located within the Ghoul Stars region. When persuasion and manipulation fail them, their battle form is described as horrifying, a transformation from the subtle, unremarkable infiltrator into something that strikes terror, even in people who have seen a great deal of terrible things. The Death Spectres have experience with this battle form. The chapter knows the Thexians better than any other Imperial institution, and the fact that the Death Spectres were specifically tasked with containing the Thexians, among other threats, suggests that whatever came out of the Ghoul Stars during the Pale Wasting had either Thexian involvement or was something that Thexian activity could have triggered or enabled. Consider the dual nature description of the Pale Wasting again: a star-spawned plague on one hand, nightmare engines on the other. A species that can infiltrate other civilizations and redirect their technology and military capabilities could, in theory, deploy the nightmare engines of those captured civilizations as a weapon while simultaneously using some biological or psychic capability of their own as the plague. The Thexians doing this through the Loxatl or the Borlak would explain why the threat looked simultaneously biological and mechanical. The Thexians themselves in their natural forms, their enslaved civilization's weapons in their redirected forms. Or the Pale Wasting might have been the Scythor fiends themselves, operating in whatever state of existence allows them to manifest the deathlessness the Nova Marine Steely credits them with. Something that cannot die does not behave like a biological enemy or a mechanical weapon. It behaves like a plague that keeps coming back after you think you have killed it. It behaves like engines that can reassemble themselves after you have destroyed them. The Scythor fiends, who retreat when threatened and return when the pressure eases, who resist exterminatus, who existed before recorded history, and who are described as not alive in any conventional sense, fit the pale wasting description in disturbing ways. The most unsettling possibility is that the pale wasting involves something that the 40,000 setting has not yet formally introduced, something from the ghoul stars that remains unnamed and uncharacterized in the existing lore, something that the deliberate destruction of the records was designed to ensure nobody could understand well enough to recreate or awaken. Whatever unmade that which cannot die, whatever technique or weapon or sacrifice the Nova Marines employed to end the pale wasting, might be information too dangerous to preserve, not because the method was heretical, but because the method, if known, could be reversed, could be used to restart whatever the pale wasting was, could allow someone in the vast expanse of human history to accidentally or deliberately bring it back. This is the territory the Death Spectres inhabit professionally. They are the experts on things that cannot be killed in conventional ways. They are the warriors who have learned, through 7,000 years of direct engagement, how to manage rather than eliminate enemies whose nature resists elimination. The containment doctrine they have developed is not a failure to achieve extermination. It is the recognition that extermination is not always achievable, and that in those cases, management is the only responsible option. That is a sophisticated strategic understanding that most of the Imperium has not had to develop, because most of the Imperium has not had to fight the Scythor fiends, or the Thexians, or whatever else the ghoul stars contain. Most of the Imperium fights enemies that can be killed, eventually, given enough firepower and enough sacrifice. The Death Spectres fight enemies where the relationship between force applied and threat reduced is not linear. Enemies where the hardest part is not the killing, but the recognizing that killing might not be the point. Extended section, the Death Watch and the Death Spectres, operating outside the ghoul stars. The Death Watch is the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, the Inquisition's specialist force for combating alien threats throughout the Imperium. It recruits from Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, taking individual warriors and forging them into kill teams capable of dealing with Xenos threats that ordinary military force cannot adequately address. Each warrior who serves in the Death Watch brings the specific skills and knowledge of their home, chapter, and the combination of different chapter traditions and capabilities creates something more flexible and more specialized than any single chapter's forces could be on their own. The Death Spectres are natural contributors to the Death Watch. They have more direct experience with alien threats of unusual character than virtually any other chapter in the Imperium. Thousands of years of fighting the Scythor fiends, the Thexians, the Necron-flayed ones of the Bone Kingdom, and unnamed entities that have no catalog entry in Imperial records has given them a body of practical knowledge about Xenos behavior, capability, and weakness that is unique in the Imperium's institutional knowledge base. Leandro Karras's service with Kill Team Talon, the primary Death Spectre's perspective in the Steve Parker novels, shows what this looks like in practice. Karras brings to the Death Watch a measured analytical intelligence combined with considerable psychic capability, the scholar of the team's nickname reflecting a genuine disposition toward understanding before acting, studying a situation before committing to a course. The other members of Kill Team Talon come from very different chapter traditions, each bringing their own way of approaching problems, and the friction and complementarity between those approaches is what makes the team effective. What is interesting about Karras's specific Death Watch deployment is the sense that it is not purely operational. The Messazar sent him with Archimen. That sword has been passed from Messazar to Messazar since Corcadus. Sending it with Karras on Death Watch service is not a standard equipment provision. It is a statement of something, an investment of chapter significance in whatever Karras is going to do out there in the galaxy's other wars. The implication consistently given is that the Death Watch posting is part of the Death Spectre's long game, that whatever Karras encounters and learns and does while serving with the Ordo Xenos is connected to the Great Resurrection prophecy in ways that are not yet visible. Captain Harsid, another named Death Spectre in the Death Watch, is conducting a different kind of operation entirely. He is hunting Xenos artifacts that have corrupted Adeptus Mechanicus Magi, working with Inquisitor Yazir on a threat that involves contamination and corruption through contact with alien technology. This is deeply within the Death Spectres' specific expertise. They have spent millennia in proximity to the Sheriax, an alien artifact of extraordinary power. They know, better than anyone, what alien technology can do to the people who interact with it, what it can offer, and what it costs. The question of whether the Death Spectres' unique experience with the Sheriax makes them better equipped to identify and counter corrupting Xenos artifacts, or whether it has compromised them in ways the Inquisition has not yet detected, is another that the lore raises without resolving. The Death Watch also provides a context in which Death Spectres' warriors interact with the broader galaxy in ways that their isolation in the Ghoul stars normally prevents. When Karras and his team operate alongside warriors from the Salamanders, the Black Templars, the Alpha Legion's successors, and other diverse chapter traditions, the Death Spectres' specific character becomes visible by contrast. They are quiet where others are loud, patient where others are urgent, philosophical where others are physical. The Raven Guard heritage is visible in their approach to problems, but transformed by 7,000 years of specific pressures into something that goes beyond the source material in distinctive ways. The Death Watch itself is an interesting institutional mirror for the Death Spectres. It is a force of isolation, like the Death Spectres, in the sense that Death Watch warriors are separated from their home chapters and operate in small groups rather than as part of a larger chapter structure. It is a force of secrecy, like the Death Spectres, in the sense that most of its operations are classified, and most of the threats it deals with are not widely publicized. And it is a force defined by its enemies, like the Death Spectres, in the sense that its identity is constructed entirely around the alien threats it is designed to counter. The fit is natural, and it is not accidental. Of course, the Death Spectres contribute warriors to the Death Watch. Of course, those warriors are among the most experienced and knowledgeable Xenos combatants available. Of course, the Ordo Xenos values their contribution and cultivates the relationship. And of course, the Death Spectres use that relationship for their own purposes, as they use everything as one more thread in the 7,000-year plan that the Messazar is quietly continuing, one generation at a time, patient as the stones of Occludus, certain as the slow turn of petrification that claims each Magyar in his time. Extended section, the full anatomy of an impossible chapter, pulling it all together. After all of this, it is worth pulling back and looking at the Death Spectres as a whole, at what the full picture of the chapter reveals when all the pieces are placed beside each other and seen together rather than semiphotally. What you see is a chapter that was created for a specific purpose by an Imperium that wanted someone else to deal with a problem it did not want to understand. The Pale Wasting happened, and it was terrible, and the Imperium's response was to create warriors and send them to the edge of the galaxy to make sure it did not happen again. The details of the founding, the records of the gene seed, the specifics of what those warriors were going to face, all of that was apparently considered too sensitive to document properly, and so the Dark Founding exists in the historical record as an absence, a placeholder where information should be. The chapter that emerged from that absence went to their posting and found something alien, ancient, and enormously powerful, sitting in a cavern under a world of graves at the edge of the known galaxy. And rather than reporting it to the broader Imperium and waiting for someone else to tell them what to do about it, they did what their mission and their specific situation required. They used it. Their first leader sat upon it, and every leader since has sat upon it, and they have kept this secret for 7,000 years, because they understand, better than anyone outside the chapter, that the Inquisition's response to the truth would probably end both the chapter and the function the Sheriax serves. In the meantime, they fight the things that need fighting. The Scythor fiends, who cannot be killed but can be contained. The Necron-flayed ones of the Bone Kingdom of Drazak. The Thexians, and whatever other horrors the Ghoul stars conceal in their cold dark. They recruit by whatever means are available, even when those means are troubling by ordinary standards. They maintain their homeworld of graves, and their fortress of dead voices, and their throne of glass, and their mummified brothers in the catacombs. They train their aspirants to die and come back. They send their warriors to the Death Watch when the broader Imperium needs what they have to offer, and they wait for the Kadash. Whatever else the Death Spectres are, they are a chapter with a purpose that extends beyond the tactical and the operational. They are not just doing a job, though they are doing the job with extraordinary dedication. They are waiting for a prophecy that their founding father received at the feet of the Emperor. They are maintaining conditions they believe necessary for something that has not happened yet, something that they believe will make sense of everything, will make worthwhile. Every death on the Shariax, and every mummified body in the catacombs, and every generation of warriors trained to die, and come back and die again, and come back again. They believe in something. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them, in a universe where faith has a way of being complicated by the evidence. The Death Spectres, alone in the dark, fighting things that cannot die, watching their leaders slowly turn to stone, have maintained for 7,000 years the belief that what they are doing is connected to something larger and more significant than the immediate tactical situation, that the vigil is not just containment, that the Shariax is not just power, that the graves of Occludus are not just dead, that everything is preparation for something. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and betrayal and the slow grinding of civilization against entropy, that quiet, patient, 7,000-year faith is one of the most extraordinary things in the entire setting. The Death Spectres are the chapter nobody can explain. They are also, possibly, one of the chapters that the entire setting has been quietly building toward without quite knowing it. The mystery at the edge of the galaxy that contains the answer to the galaxy's deepest question. We are going to find out eventually, or we are not. And either way, the Death Spectres will be out there, in the cold and the dark, watching, as they have always watched, as they will always watch. Extended section, what makes a chapter iconic? Why the Death Spectres deserve more attention. Every Space Marine chapter eventually becomes iconic through some combination of appearance, lore, story representation, and community enthusiasm. The Ultramarines are iconic because they are the default, the baseline that everything else is measured against. The Blood Angels are iconic because of the black rage and the red thirst, and because they are beautiful warriors carrying a tragic curse. The Space Wolves are iconic because of their Viking aesthetic and their pack bonds, and their rejection of Codex orthodoxy. Each chapter that has achieved widespread recognition has done so by having something about it that hooks people immediately and then holds them when they start to dig. The Death Spectres have not achieved that widespread recognition, and the reason is simple. They are not marketed in the same way. They do not have their own codex. They have not been the featured chapter in a major game or a prominent miniature release. Their fiction is limited to Steve Parker's books and a handful of short stories. In terms of the Warhammer 40,000 commercial ecosystem, the Death Spectres are genuinely obscure, a collector's item in a universe full of more prominently marketed factions. But everything that makes a chapter iconic is present in the Death Spectres, arguably in greater concentration than in most of the chapters that have achieved much wider recognition. Appearance. Albino Space Marines, in black armor, with bone-white helmets and blood-red eyes, wielding power scythes and performing the Mazrahim salute before they go to battle. That is one of the most immediately visually striking images in the entire setting, a combination of color and design and symbolic resonance that is both beautiful and deeply unnerving. The visual language of the Death Spectres communicates everything about them at a glance: death, precision, age, patience, something not quite right about the way they look at you. Lore. 7,000 years of a mission nobody else knows about, fighting enemies that cannot die, maintaining an alien throne that slowly kills their leaders, training by dying and coming back, carrying a prophecy about the Great Resurrection, while protecting a secret that they genuinely believe would end them if the Inquisition discovered it. This is extraordinary lore. It is layered and coherent, and full of implications that reward investigation. Every element connects to every other element in ways that deepen the further you go into it. Mystery. The Death Spectres are one of the very few Space Marine chapters where the mystery is structural rather than incidental. The mystery is not something that needs to be resolved before the chapter makes sense. The mystery is the chapter. They make sense precisely because they are inexplicable, because the questions they raise are more interesting than any answers could be. That is a rare quality in world building, and it gives the Death Spectres a longevity of interest that more thoroughly explained factions sometimes lack. Purpose. In a setting where many factions exist primarily to fight and be fought, the Death Spectres have a sense of purpose that extends beyond the tactical. They are working towards something. They believe in something specific and something large. Whatever the Great Resurrection turns out to be, the Death Spectres have been pointing toward it for 7,000 years, and that directional quality, that sense of a chapter in motion toward a destination however distant, gives them a narrative weight that pure fighting machines do not have. The community of people who have discovered the Death Spectres tends to react in a particular way. They go quiet for a moment. They say something like, "Wait," and then they start asking questions. And then they start trying to answer those questions. And then they start building theories. And then they are 3 hours deep into a wiki rabbit hole on a Tuesday night, surrounded by cold tea, which is exactly what the Ghoul Stars do to anyone who pays sufficient attention. That reaction is the mark of genuinely compelling lore. It is the mark of a faction that has been constructed with care and intelligence and a real understanding of what makes mystery attractive. The Death Spectres are not underrated in the sense of being secretly mediocre. They are underrated in the sense of being genuinely excellent, but not prominently marketed, and the gap between their actual quality and their community recognition is one that the Warhammer 40,000 universe would do well to close. Extended section, the chapter cult and the order. Internal structure and spiritual architecture. Space Marine chapters are not just military organizations. They are cultures, complete with their own philosophical frameworks, their own relationships with the Emperor's theology, their own internal hierarchies that go beyond purely military ranking. The Death Spectres have developed, over 7,000 years of isolation, one of the most distinctive chapter cultures in the setting, one that reflects every unique pressure of their situation in the specific way they have organized their internal life. The chapter's spiritual and philosophical dimension is organized around something called the Order, a cult structure that exists within the chapter and whose Grand Master is the Megir himself. The Order is not separate from the military organization of the chapter. It is integrated with it, the spiritual and tactical functions running together in a way that reflects the Death Spectres' understanding that what they are doing in the Ghoul Stars is not simply military, it is sacred. The vigil is an act of devotion as much as an act of war, and the warriors who maintain it are doing something that has dimensions the ordinary categories of soldier and officer and commander do not fully capture. Within the Order, rank and title carry resonances that pure military hierarchy does not. The Megir is not just a chapter master. He is the Grand Master of the Order, the eye that pierces the veil, the first Spectre. Each of these titles carries a specific meaning, a specific orientation toward the work the chapter does. The eye that pierces the veil is particularly evocative. It suggests a function of perception, of seeing through what ordinary vision cannot see, of understanding something about the nature of the Ghoul Stars and the Sheriacs and the Great Resurrection that remains invisible to everyone outside the Order. The Messazar, the Chief Librarian, is not just the chapter's most senior psychic warrior. He is the Megir's heir and the de facto chapter master, the person who carries the chapter's intelligence and its accumulated knowledge and its connection to the prophecy in the period when the Megir is on the throne and incapable of active leadership. When Athio Cordatus serves as Messazar, he is simultaneously the practical leader of the chapter and the person preparing himself, day by day, for the eventual moment when he too will sit upon the Sheriacs and begin the slow transformation. The Menrahir, the chapter council, handles the governance and administration of the chapter in the Messazar's periods of military focus. It is a collective leadership structure that distributes responsibility across senior officers rather than concentrating it in a single commander, which reflects both the reality of the Megir's incapacity after taking the throne and the institutional memory that has developed over 7,000 years of operating with this command structure. The Death Spectres have been practicing distributed leadership since their founding. It has become part of how they think and operate. The Wargeists of the First Company are the pinnacle of this culture, made physical. Veterans who have died and come back more times than anyone else in the chapter, who have been through everything the Ghoul Stars can provide in the way of testing and threat and horror, and who carry power scythes into battle as the living embodiment of what the Death Spectres believe, about death and rebirth, and the harvesting of enemies in the Emperor's name. When you see a wargeist, you are seeing the most experienced, the most philosophically developed, the most completely transformed product of the Death Spectre's entire cultural project. You are seeing what 7,000 years of dying and coming back and dying again produces in the warriors who survive all of it. The mummification of the dead is one of the most specific and tangible expressions of the chapter's theology. Other chapters honor their dead. Other chapters preserve gene seed and name their fallen on honor rolls and light candles at shrines. The Death Spectres mummify their brothers and put them in the catacombs beneath the fortress monastery, keeping them present in a physical sense, maintaining their forms as a kind of testimony. The dead of the Death Spectres are not departed in any simple sense. They are still there, beneath the fortress, beneath the world, part of the ongoing vigil in their preserved way. They are witnesses. They are companions. They are the accumulated experience of the chapter made, physical and permanent. This is a relationship with death that is genuinely unlike anything else in the Space Marine tradition. Most chapters revere their dead, but do not keep them nearby in preserved physical form as a matter of routine practice. The Death Spectres make the presence of the dead structural. The dead are there. They have always been there. Every chapter master who ever served, every warrior who ever fell in the Ghoul Stars, everything the chapter has been and done is preserved and present beneath the fortress that sits above the Sheriax that has been slowly killing chapter masters since the founding. The layers of sacrifice and preservation and enduring presence go all the way down, from the surface graveyards to the catacombs to the Temple of Voices to the Sheriax itself, and they speak with a single voice about what the Death Spectres believe and what they are working toward. They are a chapter built around the idea that nothing is truly lost, that the dead persist, that sacrifice accumulates towards something, that the long, slow, painful work of maintaining the vigil is meaningful not in spite of its difficulty, but because of it, because the difficulty is the measure of the thing's importance, and the importance of what the Death Spectres are doing is, in their understanding, absolute. 7,000 years. Every Magir turned to stone, every fallen warrior mummified in the dark, every aspirant who died in the initiation trial and came back with the knowledge of what death feels like and the certainty that they can survive it again. Every generation of prime stock, selected and transported to breeding worlds so that the next generation of warriors can exist. Every campaign in the dark against enemies that cannot be killed, every astropathic message sent into an indifferent galaxy, and perhaps never received. Every day of the vigil continued because the vigil cannot end, because the Death Spectres believe that if it ends, something breaks, something fails, something that cannot be repaired tears open, and what comes through will be worse than the pale wasting, worse than the Great Rift, worse than anything the Imperium has yet faced. That is the weight the Death Spectres carry. That is the cost of being the chapter nobody can explain. And they carry it without complaint, in the dark and the cold, with the patience of warriors who have learned through direct experience that death is not the end of service, it is only a beginning.